And this will be recorded and shared with folks following this webinar. But for those of you that may not know who NASCAS is, we are the National Association for State Community Services Programs, and we are headquartered in Washington, D.C. We have been around since 1977. We're going to be celebrating our 45th anniversary as an organization this October. And we are the sole national association charged with enhancing for and advocating for the state administrators of both weatherization and CSBG. And in the next slide, we have a pretty small but mighty team. I am actually located in Atlanta, Georgia. We have folks spread out in every single time zone, which makes meetings tricky sometimes. But we also have Jonathan Ballou, our senior WAP manager, and he's out in Helena, Montana. We have Kai Garvin, who just joined us about a month ago as our new dedicated WAP workforce program manager, and Britt Pomish, who is our senior public affairs specialist. And these are probably the four of us you'll hear from the most regarding weatherization. And we are out in Olympia, Washington, and Texas, Montana, and Georgia. So just, all over, which is really great because we all come with our different perspectives on things. So it is nice having folks in different areas of the country. In the next slide, I just wanted to spend one moment giving credit to our board. NASCAS executive board and our regional reps are comprised 100% by the actual state members that we serve. And we hold elections every 2 years. And currently, Beverly Buchanan from Arkansas is our president. And another important person there for folks to know is Jeff Haino. He is the WAP chair from Wisconsin. And in the next slide, I just wanted to bring this map up because in addition to that executive board, we hold elections and our members vote in 2 regional reps per each of our 5 regions. So we have 10 regional representatives from weatherization and 10 from CSBG. And we are very grateful and fortunate to have New Mexico's very own Troy Cucciara as an active and engaged member of the board who meets monthly with leadership in the Department of Energy with the NASCAS board, as well as providing guidance on our strategic plan. And if folks ever want to get involved more in NASCAS, our conferences, we also have several working groups and other opportunities to stay engaged. In the next slide, I just wanted to touch on some of our state assistance. So in addition to developing tools like the Weatherization Day Toolkit or some of our wage surveys or career flyers, we also try to facilitate peer-to-peer exchanges. We conduct 2 national training conferences each year. The winter one is always held in DC. And then we have an annual training conference, most often in September, and that revolves around the country based on who's willing to be a host state. I personally would love to see New Mexico in 2024, 2025. And then we do trainings like this one. So, depending on what our members need, we try to rise to the occasion and provide the training. And before I go any further, I'm just kind of curious. We do have some polls, and I'm going to go ahead and launch this one, Rebecca, just in case the folks virtually can get on. And for others in the room, feel free to shout out. What's your level of understanding around weatherization procurement? I feel confident. I am learning, but could use more training. I feel unsure about most of it. 2 CFR 200 is a total mystery to me.
I feel very confident.
Awesome.
All right.
Okay. And we've got some folks on the call that are saying they're learning and could use more training. And some are feeling unsure about most of it, which is not unfair. That is completely okay to feel that way. All right. And another one said they're learning but could use more training. Well, then I'm glad we're here today because it's exactly what we're going to do. I'll just share those results with y'all for a second. Could you see all of that okay, Rebecca? The results and everything? Okay, nice. All right. Well, and then I just want to take a moment to introduce Rebecca. I know she'll introduce herself a little bit more, but as you'll hear about a little later, about a year and a half ago, NASCAS went to RFP to obtain the professional services of qualified CPAs to conduct, what can often be very complicated and ultimately extremely important training for our state members. And we selected CLA, and I've had the privilege to work with Rebecca on several occasions and several trainings. So I feel that you're in good hands for the rest of this morning and afternoon. And Rebecca, I'm going to hand things over to you if that's okay.
All right. Thank you, Andrea. All right. Yes, my name is Rebecca Field. I'm a principal with a professional services firm called Clifton Larson Allen. Just a little background about myself. I lead our grant compliance service team. So we provide services to organizations that receive grant funding. It's usually centered around federal grants because those are the fun ones with all the rules and regulations. But the first 10 years of my career, I did audit. Mainly, for nonprofit organizations. And I really liked those fun things called single audits. Some people called me a weirdo for liking those. Some called me a unicorn. Either way, I really like that compliance aspect of it. And so then I turned it into a consulting service line at our firm, realizing that, man, there's a lot of organizations out there that just need help navigating through the rules and regulations. So we provide all sorts of different services along those lines. Trainings happen to be my favorite. I love getting out there, interacting with the clients, talking about the issues and the things that they need to know more about, or just questions that they have. So if you have any questions during this training today, please feel free to shout those out. I don't mind getting interrupted. I would much rather talk about your questions, your issues, while they're current in your mind and while we're currently talking about that topic. I also understand that a number of you are veterans out there, probably those that shouted out that you feel very confident. That's great. I'm sure you have a lot of knowledge and perspectives and insights too that you can share that will also help other participants on this training today. So I just really want to make sure this is an open discussion, that people can feel free to share their thoughts and ask those questions. All right, and I was just going to mention, Andrea, you said you'd love it if your September conference went to New Mexico. I happen to have my Meow Wolf mug with me today that I got down in Santa Fe about exactly a year ago. So I thought that was an awesome experience. I'm sure many of you have been to it, but I just thought that was kind of funny. I randomly grabbed it and I'm like, well, that's perfect. That's fate. All right, so today's agenda and what we're going to accomplish. We're going to talk about the applicable regulations for the WAP program. General procurement requirements. Talk through those different procurement methodologies, right? So we're going to really dig into 2 CFR 200 or the uniform guidance. I didn't see anyone answer 2 CFR 200 is a total mystery to me, but I'll say, I'm in that regulation pretty much every single day. I call it kind of my second language. And there's still little pieces of information in there that maybe I hadn't read through before. There's still little surprises, if you will, that I even find within the uniform guidance. So I think it's a great piece of information to just cover kind of over and over, right? Because especially with procurement, there's so many different complexities and little intricacies, and you really need to be aware of them to be in full compliance. So we're really going to dig into what those regulations are. We're going to talk through a federal procurement checklist. I'm a big fan of checklists, any kind of tools or template that can aid in proper grants management. I'm a big fan of putting those in place. So I have a checklist that I'm more than willing to share with you guys. I know I sent it on to Troy and David, so they have it as a resource too to pass along if you find it beneficial for your entity. you can go ahead and use that. Contract provisions talk about what provisions and clauses really need to be included within your contract agreements when you're procuring with federal funds. We're going to talk through a vehicle purchasing process and what that means to your entity. Talk about then how you need to properly manage that vehicle. Talk through the definition of what meets federal equipment. And then talk about proper disposition process. All right, I know whenever people hear we're having a full day training, they're always wondering, when are the breaks? When are the breaks? When's the lunch? So here we have it listed out. We're gonna go here for about another hour 15. We had to put it in 3 different time zones because as Andrea mentioned, we're kind of spanning the country here. I'm in Minneapolis. And so if you're in Mountain Time, we're gonna be taking a break here at 9:45. We'll resume again at 10, take another break at 11:45, your time for lunch. Then we'll reconvene for an afternoon session and look to adjourn at about 2 o'clock. And this presentation will be shared following the training. There will be a number of different links in there. So don't worry, you will have this as a resource to use going forward. All right, talking about applicable regulations. All right, I mentioned this 2 CFR 200. For those of you who are not familiar with it, that is where the OMB, or the Office of Management and Budget, they codified and put into federal regulation this overarching regulation that governs any federal financial assistance. So the full name is the Uniform Administrative Requirements, Cost Principles, and Audit Requirements for Federal Awards. All right, so this regulation is applicable to all federal financial assistance. So that could be things such as grants, it could be cooperative agreements, it could be other forms of federal financial assistance, or it also applies to any subawards, right? So for those of you who are subrecipients through the state, this regulation flows through within your terms and conditions. Now, just a quick note on the difference between a grant and a cooperative agreement, because I get that question a lot. A grant is when the entity or the prime recipient is doing the majority of the program, right? They're responsible for the program accomplishments pretty much fully. Cooperative agreement would be when the awarding agency, so whether it be Department of Energy, Department of State, whoever it is that is granting that funds, they're putting substantial involvement to meet the program accomplishment as well. Typically, we see grants and subawards as being the agreements or the assistance form that the uniform guidance is applicable to. All right, so the uniform guidance is split into 6 parts. And I'm actually, once I go through the subparts, I'm actually going to pull up the uniform guidance. I like to do this during trainings so that participants can see how easy it is to navigate through the electronic version of it. But just to give an overview. So you have a subpart A that houses the acronyms and definitions. This is actually a really good resource. I actually go back to it quite often. Things like, oh yeah, what's modified total direct costs again? What does that exclude? Certain really key pieces of information of compliance are actually within the definition of a term. Subpart B, general provisions. Subpart C, pre-federal award requirements. This subpart actually applies more to the awarding agencies, kind of what information they need to have in their funding opportunity, things of that nature. I always say subpart D, subpart E are kind of the meat of the uniform guidance. So within subpart D, you have the post-federal award requirements or the administrative requirements. So that is where things like equipment management, property standards, that's within subpart D. We'll be going over that section, as well as procurement, right? That actually takes up about 10 or 11 subsections within subpart D. So that's where those administrative type requirements are housed. Then you have subpart E, cost principles. This talks about allowable costs. What can you use federal financial assistance funds for? What can you not spend it on? When do you need to go and get prior approval? There's about 40 different selected items of cost that they really talk through a little more specifics about when that cost would be allowable, when it would be unallowable, things like time and effort documentation. It goes into, the specifics on that. So I say really subpart D and E is most kind of the most common sections that you would go to get guidance. Then subpart F, audit requirements. This is where it talks about once you need that single audit, what are the auditee's responsibilities? What is the auditor responsibilities? Perhaps you have heard of A133 audits before. A133 itself was superseded with the uniform guidance, but I think it's one of those terms that will never go away. Now they're really just single audits, but a lot of people still like to use that A133. Either way, this is really the same. This is what it's referring to, is how does that single audit need to be conducted? So I'm going to try to click on this link here. I'm going to see if it stays within the screen that I'm sharing. Otherwise, I might need to pick up a new screen. Let's see, can someone confirm whether they're seeing the Code of Federal Regulations or if they're still seeing my...
For me, I see the slide, the PowerPoint slide, Rebecca, still.
Okay, let me just, if you don't mind, switch something around really quickly here.
Sure.
Rebecca, the link was there, but it was not clickable. I can drop it in the chat if that helps.
Oh, it wasn't a hot link in there, huh? Okay. I apologize for that. All right. Let me try one thing. There we go. Okay, hopefully now you're seeing Code of Federal Regulations. Okay, great.
Yeah.
Okay, so again, I really just like to pull this up because, some people hear federal regulation. There's no way I'm digging into that. That's going to be way too complex. I do have to say this one is very easy to navigate around, very easy to read through. So there's a lot of different links, right? So subpart D. All right, I need to look up procurement. Don't know exactly how far down it is, so I'm just going to do Control F. Okay. Well, if I typed it properly, it would be more efficient. Procurement, right? Oh, there we go. Procurement standards. That took me what, 10 seconds to get there. And then you can really read through. And like I said, I think it's very easy. It's kind of in layman's terms for the most part. I think now maybe again, I may be biased because I've been in here so much that that I really understand what it's saying. But I even think for somebody who's new to the uniform guidance, it is truly a good resource. I would have it bookmarked somewhere so that you can just get to it quickly. Otherwise, as you can see, it's not a super quick and easy website. It's not like uniformguidance.gov or anything like that. So it's easier to just bookmark it. But either way, even if you do a web search for 2 CFR 200 or the uniform guidance, you'll eventually get here in a very short amount of time. I did also want to pull up the acronyms and definitions. As I mentioned, these are, I think, a great resource, especially when you get into the definitions. Right, when you're talking about, well, I'll just do modified total direct costs as an example. Right, okay, so I know that modified total direct costs, excludes a certain cost, but what was it? Oh yeah, okay, so here it says excludes equipment, capital expenditures, charges for patient care, rental costs, tuition remission, so on and so forth. So again, I think the definitions are a great place to jump to. And then of course, subpart D and subpart E. Maybe I'll show you subpart E as well. Cost principles. All right, so, all right, well, let's see, what was that thing about travel? Oh, there's a whole subsection here on travel costs. So it really talks about, okay, what makes a travel cost allowable, right? And in this case, it really refers back to what is your organization's kind of policy on it and things of that nature. But again, it's just really easy to kind of jump to what you're looking for.
And then just so I remember, Rebecca, were you pushing the Control F to get to find the exact words that you were looking
yes,
for?
Just to find. So I know on MacBooks it's might be the other way to get there. But however you normally would search for words, yep, it can jump right there.
Mm-hmm.
Yep. Or, there's also links kind of within here, which is really handy too. It takes you right to where that clause might be referencing to. So just wanted to, I always like to pull that up as a reference so people kind of believe me when I say how easy it is to navigate through. Okay, so digging into that procurement standards section of the uniform guidance. As I mentioned, this is a pretty lengthy one, right? They have subsections on general procurement standards, on competition. This is an area that when the uniform guidance came out, which it came out in almost 10 years ago now, 9 years ago in 2014, it really expanded what the OMB requires for full and open competition. If you looked at the old circular, A110, it was about a paragraph. It said, yep, you should have, full and open competition. Now, if you pull the uniform guidance up, it pretty much takes up an entire computer screen. It really stresses that the government wants you to make sure you're kind of considering as many different vendors, contractors as possible. And you'll note I kind of use that term or those terms interchangeably. The old circular called them vendors. The uniform guidance refers to that third party as a contractor. I think a lot of people reading the uniform guidance or hearing the word contractor, their mind kind of goes to kind of a general contractor in a construction type project. Here they really just mean a vendor. So I sometimes just for easiness use the word vendor, but if you're reading through the regulation and it uses the term contractor, they're really, again, talking about that third party that you're procuring goods or services from. So again, they really want you to kind of open up that population of vendors that you may possibly procure with. Then there's a whole section on methods of procurement to be followed, a subsection on contracting with small and minority businesses, women's business enterprises, and labor surplus area firms. We'll talk about what that really means and what steps need to be taken there. There's a new subsection, this is new as of November of 2020, talking about domestic preferences for procurements, and we'll talk through that. A subsection on procurement of recovered materials. There's a subsection on contract cost and price. Subsection on federal awarding agency or pass-through entity review, and they're really, that one pretty much just states, hey, they have the ability to review your procurement records really anywhere along the process, maybe pre-procurement, during your procurement, or afterwards. Talks a subsection on bonding requirements, and then a subsection on contract provisions. So we're going to cover on the ones that really affect your procurement processes and what you need to be considering. All right, one thing I wanted to bring up right away was a weatherization program notice. It was 17.6. This was effective back in 2017. It's called the subject was property acquired under the Weatherization Assistance Program, including vehicle and equipment purchases. And I really want to talk about this because it really was a shift in how entities in the WAP program could account for and treat their equipment purchases. So the purpose was to serve to provide grantees with guidance on property acquisitions, including those purchased vehicles and equipment for use in the WAP. And that program notice superseded a previous one. So this is now the current kind of guidance, if you will, for the WAP program on vehicle and equipment purchases. And the provisions of that guidance apply to recipients and subrecipients of financial assistance under the Department of Energy WAP. All right, and it says that grantees shall comply with applicable law, including regulations that are contained in that lovely regulation that I just pulled up to CFR 200, as well as other guidance applicable to these regulations as the Department of Energy may from time to time prescribe for the administration of financial assistance. So the thing with any kind of federal financial assistance is there's a couple different layers. of where requirements and regulations might come from, right? The uniform guidance kind of being the top one, the overarching. But then after that, you really have any awarding agency specific regulations, right? So this is an example of where it's saying, yep, you got to be, in compliance with the uniform guidance, but then you also, need to adhere to any additional guidance that we have for those compliance requirements. All right, and just talking through the actual definition of equipment. So it's defined as any tangible personal property. So it could include information technology systems that has a useful life of more than 1 year and a per unit acquisition cost, which equals or exceeds the lesser of either the capitalization level established by an organization or 5,000, right? So if an organization's capitalization policy is maybe 2,500, well, now you look at, okay, is this piece of property that we purchased, are we going to be, does it have a useful life of over a year? And is it over 2,500? If the organization's capitalization policy is 10,000, well, now you default down to, is it useful life over a year and more than 5,000? Many entities choose to have their capitalization policy at $5,000, especially if they're very heavily grant funded, for the administrative easiness of just having one level that they need to consider for whether something is considered equipment or not. All right. So talking about then the regulation of property standards. So we'll get into kind of that notice and how that affected the accounting. At this point, I'm just kind of trying to pinpoint what different pieces of regulation and guidance we're going to be talking through and really the sources of them. So the property standards that we're going to be talking through, that comes from the subsections 310 to 316 in the uniform guidance. So there's a subsection on insurance coverage, on real property, on federally owned and exempt property, on equipment, a subsection on supplies, what's considered to be supplies, one on intangible property, and then property trust relationship. We're going to really be focusing on that 200-313 as it relates to equipment. All right, just give me a second here. I'm going to pull back my Zoom screen so I can see if there's any chat.
I was just going to ask one question for myself, because I swear I learn something new in this program every day. But what do they kind of consider intangible property? I was just curious what they.
Yep. Am I still? And I just want to make sure. Am I still sharing my screen here?
No, you stopped when you went to look at the chat.
Okay, got it. Yep. So intangible property could mean things like intellectual property. Pretty much. I'm trying to think if like results from research is included in there. If you'd like, I can pull up the definition from the uniform guidance.
Yeah, I was just kind of curious. I'm like, what does that mean? But that makes sense what you just described.
Yeah. Usually it's intellectual property.
Okay.
Yep, great question.
We're using a software system called MIP. 2 of our providers are using that. And we can't really see it when we do inventory, but it's there. There's not really a way to document that other than the serial numbers and stuff like that. So would that be intangible? Is software systems that are expensive?
You know what? I think actually that's a great question. If it's developed in-house, if it's like, then it may be. Otherwise, I think it actually meets the definition of kind of equipment. And we go back and pull up that. This is something we can dig into right now if it would be really beneficial.
I think others will have that question. I was a little surprised that information systems were, in your slide, 2 slides back, were seen as equipment. Like, to me, that would have been more intangible, but that's, I guess that's why they have those definitions. Yeah.
Oh. All right, let's dig into it.
All right.
Some research. Okay. Okay, so we'll go into D. Oh, again, tangible property here. So here, let's go to the definition then. Tangible property. All right. Property having no physical existence, such as trademarks, copyrights, patents, and patent applications and property, such as loans, notes, and other debt instruments, lease agreements, stock, and other instrument of property ownership. What, in that case, whether the property is tangible or intangible. All right, so up here under information technology systems, right, that says it means computing devices, ancillary equipment, software, firmware, and similar procedures, services, including support services, and related resources. And then there's also a definition of computing devices and equipment. But I think to your point of that software is information technology systems. And so then really it meets the definition of that personal property. So if we go back up to equipment, right, where it says means tangible personal property, including information technology systems. So everything that was in that definition of information technology systems is really encompassed then in that definition of equipment.
That's helpful.
Yep.
Thank you.
Yep. Right. Okay. So digging into the general procurement requirements. All right, I always like to point out that when the uniform guidance or when these slides or when myself, when I use the word must versus the word should, there's a clear distinction. The word must is an absolute requirement. I mean, something that the government absolutely requires you to do or to have in place or to follow. When it uses the word should, that's actually a best practice or a suggestion or a recommendation. So that's something that you really need to keep in mind as you're reading through the guidance. An example of this and how this really became defined is when the uniform guidance first came out. When us within the industry, the public accounting industry, were taking a look at it, we noticed things like organizations should have an internal control framework that meets the requirements of COSO. We said, well, boy, that's a pretty robust internal control framework. That are they really going to require every single one of their grantees? What about those really small nonprofits, that might only have 3-4 people on staff? How are they going to meet that? Well, then kind of going back and forth with OMB, they said, oh, well, we just mean if they can, that would be great. That's kind of the gold standard, right? That's what they should be aspiring for. Said, okay, well, you need to just make it very clear then to the readers of this guidance, kind of when you mean something absolutely needs to be in place and when something, again, is just a best practice suggestion or recommendation. All right, I also like to make it very clear before we even dig into these requirements, what type of costs they apply to. So for goods and services charged to, or it's important to note that costs used for match, directly charged to a federal award. That's what they apply to. They do not apply to costs and charges for a non-federal program. They don't apply either to costs or charges that end up in your indirect cost pool or your overhead pool, right? That's an often misconception is, well, those costs end up being indirectly charged to my grant through my rate. So I better follow procurement for those too. And actually the regulation is very clear. It's just those that are directly charged to a federal award that need to follow the Uniform Guidance procurement requirements. Okay, so let's dig into really then what do the requirements say? So it says you must have and use, so this is an area where it's an absolute requirement, documented procurement procedures that need to be consistent with state, local, and tribal laws and regulations and the standards of the Uniform Guidance, right, for the acquisition of property or services required under a federal award or subaward. Right, so if it is a state entity, then they need to also consider, okay, what does the Uniform Guidance say I need to do for proper procurement? Maybe what are our state statutes say I need to do for procurement? And oftentimes then they'll end up with kind of a hybrid, right? You have to look at, okay, what's the lowest threshold maybe for requiring certain pieces of information, or how do I have to handle the procurement, process? If it's just a normal nonprofit organization that does not have any state, local, or tribal laws that it also needs to follow, well, then it's a little more clear, right? You just look to the Uniform Guidance. All right, and so you really do need to have, and I bolded here, the documented part of it. If you've ever gone through a single audit or will be going through a single audit, one thing your auditors will ask for is, okay, can I see your procurement policy? Right? And they should be looking through that policy to make sure that it is as robust as it needs to be, and that it really does include all the different pieces that have requirements within them, within the procurement subsections that we'll be talking about. A lot of times that is a finding that we have to give out to clients is, we'll ask for a procurement policy and they might hand over their just general organization purchasing policy of who approves at what dollar amount, which is also important to have. You need to have those in place too. But they were really missing that procurement procedures and policy around how are they going to procure with federal funds? How are we going to meet all the different compliance requirements? Okay, and so the Uniform Guidance also says that you have to have a documented policy. Oftentimes when I'm writing about individual conflicts of interest, oftentimes when I'm helping organizations write up different federal grants management policies, we might have this as kind of a section within the procurement policy. It can be an outside policy as well. It can be maybe in your overall organizational conflict of interest policy too. But it does somewhere within those policies, you need to have one that states that no employee, officer, member of the governing board, or even an agent, advisor, consultant, attorney, accountant, or shareholder, right? So those are all the interested parties that we're considering here. They cannot participate in the selection, award, or administration of a contract that is supported by a federal award if he or she has a real or apparent conflict of interest. All right, so that was a lot of words there, but essentially what I like to highlight here on this slide is the Uniform Guidance isn't saying that if a conflict of interest happens to be there, it doesn't mean that as an organization or as an entity, you can't procure with that vendor that interested party has a conflict with. It just means that now that individual at the organization, right, whether it be one of those interested parties that's underlined there, they just can't participate again in the selection, award, or administration of the contract. Whenever I bring this up with kind of my state and local government clients, and they might be from a smaller town, they say, well, we're not going to get any work done if we can't ever use a vendor that we have a conflict of interest with, because kind of it's just a small town and everyone kind of knows each other. I said, well, no. Again, this doesn't say that you can't use that vendor. It just says that then that individual kind of needs to remove themselves that has a conflict from deciding whether or not, the entity or organization should use that vendor. Or if you even enter into a contract, they can't really be the one then in charge of managing that relationship either. So again, it's just something that you need to be aware of, need to have good processes in place to identify those conflicts of interest and when they may be there. All right, so not only did that kind of population of interested parties include, and I'm going to just say them again, employees, officers, members of governing boards, or really anyone in a kind of advisory position, to kind of summarize that fourth bullet point. But it also includes any immediate family and other persons directly connected to that interested party by law or through a business arrangement, right? So now the kind of population of who may have that conflict of interest expands a little bit when you consider you also have to think about, does any of their immediate family members, or again, persons directly connected through law, have a conflict? Right, and what could that financial interest that's creating a conflict of interest? So that could include things like employment, right? Stock ownership in that vendor, creditor or debtor relationship, or prospective employment with the organization selected or to be selected for the contract or subaward. So that could really create that financial interest, create that conflict of interest. All right, so again, it's really key to have that process in place to identify and to disclose. Many organizations might have kind of an annual conflict of interest disclosure process, right? That's best practice to get that out there. At the very least, right, those who would be the decision makers as to whether or not to enter into a contract with those third parties, they need to be covered by some kind of disclosure process. All right, then also, so those were individual conflicts of interest. The uniform guidance also speaks to organizational conflicts of interest. Oh, I see a question here. If there's time, would you mind giving us an example of how to handle the conflict of interest in the policies? Yes, so are you speaking to how it should be actually documented in a policy, or how then that policy should roll out into procedures?
Thank you, Rebecca, both. Really, so we do have some small areas in New Mexico where we could have people that are related to each other. So how do we protect ourselves if we want to use those vendors and be transparent and clear? And like you said, it wouldn't make sense for those vendors and contractors to not be eligible for participation. What would be an example of what a policy would look like?
Yep. So like I said, when I usually help write up procurement policies, right, I'll have a subsection in there that pretty much mirrors kind of what was in that slide, word for word, saying, hey, we as an organization, we understand, right, what that conflict of interest might include. We understand that these are the interested parties that can then not participate, in the selection. And it really just kind of mirrors what the regulations say. So that's typically my methodology for most federal grants management policy documentation is, hey, just kind of match it up and mirror with what the regulation says you need to be in compliance with. And then as far as kind of putting that into practice, again, could have an annual kind of maybe just all staff, conflict of interest disclosure. Sometimes though, I'll say it's more efficient. That's always a best practice. That's always a best practice to have in place. But when you're thinking about procuring with vendors, at the time of consideration, right? So especially if you had kind of the competitive procurement, which now I'm jumping ahead of myself here, but where you're getting proposals back and you're going to be evaluating them, right then, whatever that party is that's going to be evaluating them, do a, conflict of interest disclosure opportunity, right? Then really that should be done before, if you're sending that RFP out to specific vendors, right? We're going to send them to these 5. Does anybody have a conflict of interest with these 5 vendors, right? Oftentimes though, or not oftentimes, but sometimes you might receive proposals back from vendors that you didn't initially send out. Maybe it was because it was a publicly advertised, or, it got through the industry. Then again, you should have a check to make sure that these are the proposals we got back before we start evaluating them. Is anyone in this kind of decision-making group do you have a conflict of interest here? It probably depends on how often, right, you're procuring with federal funds. But those are just some examples, right? Either kind of an annual standard process, and then again, it should be procurement specific. Does that kind of answer the question?
It answers my question. I'm not sure if anybody else had questions based on that.
And I'd say too, you know, on your evaluation method, and so again, not to jump ahead of myself, but it does relate to it. You need to have documented procedures on how are we evaluating, you know, these vendors that replied back. I say right in that documentation, right, have the question of, you know, individual conflict of interest check. Was there any, you know, conflicts of interest? So that you have it nicely documented that, yes, we inquired. No one here that was evaluating these proposals did have a conflict of interest, right? So I'm a big proponent of documentation. I can't shake that from being an auditor, right? You'll hear me talk about documentation over and over and proper justification of different things. I think that's really key to good grants management is having then all those different areas documented in one way or another. All right, so now talking about organizational conflicts of interest. So the uniform guidance, and this was something new when it came out in 2014, it says that non-federal entities, so grantees or subrecipients, that if you have a parent, an affiliate, or a subsidiary organization that is not a state, local government, or Indian tribe, the non-federal entity must also maintain standards of conduct covering organizational conflicts of interest. That essentially will say, we will not procure within our own organization, right? We won't procure from our parent company, from our subsidiary company. I get the question of, well, what does affiliate mean, right? Because a lot of times too, we see in the nonprofit industry, a lot of organizations might consider themselves to be affiliated or partner organizations. I believe this needs to be more of a legal affiliation, right? Maybe you have common management or ownership, excuse me. I really refer back to, is it legally affiliated? Not just, you know, are we kind of partners in the industry? This doesn't happen very often. However, I did have an example where it was a higher education institution client, and they needed some books for their federal program. So instead of kind of shopping around and seeing different prices out there, they just literally walked down to the bookstore on campus and bought books for the program. We had to point this out and say, well, you really can't do that. You can't procure within your own organization. You really should have, you know, followed federal procurement standards. So it doesn't happen all too often when you'd procure within the organization, but there are some examples out there.
Hey, Rebecca, I know you can't see because you're sharing your screen, but a question came in that Troy typed in the chat. Does the conflict of interest need to be renewed annually or project by project?
Yep, that's a great question. And so again, there's no absolute regulation or requirement around this. This kind of refers back to, okay, well, what's best practice and what kind of makes the most sense at an entity or organization level for, you know, what those conflicts of interest could impact. So again, oftentimes I'll see it like with my nonprofit clients that they have the board and staff leadership just every year. It's part of their annual process. Now, again, that kind of covers a whole host of what those conflicts might be. It might not actually get down to a specific vendor that's being considered for a contract with federal funds, right? So that's why I think it's still important to have it on kind of the vendor consideration level, if you will. So it's kind of one of those things that you have judgment on what makes the most sense to make sure that within our processes, we would somehow pick these up.
That makes sense, Rebecca. And I'm just curious, Troy, do you monitor the sub-grantees annually? And do you have something in the, maybe the programmatic or fiscal monitoring that reviews their conflict of interest statement?
And Andrea, yeah, we do monitor annually for procurement standards and conflict of interest. Mm-hmm. But what we don't do is monitor that conflict of interest is specific to procurement. Mm-hmm. We normally look at the conflict of interest that is residing with the staff and the board members. Yeah. So the person that came in was specific to procurement, but I suppose that would apply also to staff and board members, because I've seen that arise quite a few times as well. So Rebecca's answer that it should make sense, that does make sense. As a matter of fact, the answer itself does. And I think it would apply to this as well. Yeah.
Okay, good questions. Thank you. All right, yep, and so we covered this. That's really what they're considering that organizational conflict of interest to be. It just basically says because they're unable or even appears to be unable, right? That's something that you have to consider with the conflict of interest, either a real or apparent conflict of interest, right? And that apparent conflict of interest sometimes gets a little gray, but you know, what a prudent person kind of from the outside, would they think that conflict of interest might be there, right? So that's really where that real and apparent. You have to kind of think of both situations for both the individual conflicts of interest and these organizational ones. All right, we got some questions here. All right, so what is the dollar threshold for property to be considered equipment per federal definition? You guys think it's 3,500, 7,500, 5,000, or 10,000? All right, we got some answers coming in.
Yep, you got two responses that came in. I'll give it just another second and then I'll share the results. I know there's a lot of folks just there in the room. Right. So it looks like 100% picked 5,000.
All right, nice. Nailed it. That is the correct answer, is 5,000. Again, that one actually could have a caveat though. I should have put an asterisk there. Or the lesser of 5,000 or the organizational's capitalization policy. So that could be considered a question. But per the definition, federal, that's the dollar amount that they have in there. Okay, and here's one. What is the simplified acquisition threshold? We haven't covered this yet. Curious if anyone is aware of this and if they think it's 1,000, 100,000, excuse me, 150,000, 200,000, or 250,000.
Anybody in the room want to take a shot? 250. We got two 250s in the room.
All right. There we go.
SAT is what it's abbreviation. An example, yeah, acquisition threshold. She's probably going to go in the definition of that. But if we were to buy something or procure a service that falls into one of these categories, so a plumber that is going to give us $100,000 worth of business in a year, that would be. Well, I just use 100 as an example.
All right, so I hear some good discussion there. I see one answer came in at 100,000, another one at 250,000, and it sounds like the consensus in the room was 250,000. So it is 250,000, and this is an area that we will definitely go into on future slides. But it is a threshold that does change periodically. I think at one time it was at 100,000, jumped up to 150,000, currently at 250,000. So we will definitely talk through that though. Okay, true or false question here. You are always prohibited from using a vendor if there is a conflict of interest. Is that true or is that false? See who is listening. Did I just accidentally X out the poll?
No, I think you did. No, it's perfect. I just shared the results.
All right. Yes, you guys answered correctly with false. You're not prohibited from using a vendor necessarily. You just need to make sure that that interested party excludes themselves from the process. Very good. Ooh, okay. What subpart of the uniform guidance are the administrative requirements found? Is it subpart D, subpart A, subpart F, or subpart E?
Did we ask for a show of hands on some of these, or what do you think? For those in the room, how many people think it's F? Nobody? Anybody think it's D? Some? Any A's in the room? How about E's? Rebecca, it looks like subpart D is winning.
All right. Looks like one came in also as A. So I will just go and say it is D. Do you remember A was acronyms and definitions? F was a single audit. E was cost principles, and D is the administrative requirements. So it is D. All right. All right, so jumping back into procurement procedures. All right, so your procurement procedures must avoid acquisition of unnecessary or duplicative items, right? That seems like pretty straightforward. We shouldn't be using federal funds for things that we don't need to buy. But either way, this is one that it definitely says it is a must. A consideration should be given to consolidating or breaking out procurements to obtain a more economical purchase, right? So this is an area where you see the word should, and this is where they're saying, hey, why don't you give thought to, does it make sense to consolidate, kind of bundle some purchases together? Or does it actually make sense to, we were going to buy 10 things in the same transaction. Does it make sense to kind of split it into two? Would we get a better price? Right? You'll see this term economical purchase. And the next one, it says economical approach. Right? Of course, the government wants you to get kind of best bang for the buck as possible. So they throw out these ideas of, what considerations you can give to get that best economical purchase. Also, it says where appropriate. So again, it's not an absolute must. It just says where appropriate. An analysis should be made of lease versus purchase alternatives and any other appropriate analysis to determine the most economical approach, right? So when you hear lease versus purchase, it really does come down to property, right? Does it make sense for us to purchase a vehicle? Would it make more sense for us to lease it? Right? And there's a lot of different considerations that probably should go into that analysis. All right. Oh, I see a question came in.
Mm-hmm.
Does this apply to construction projects?
My question was specifically related to the simple acquisition, right? Because simple acquisition does not apply for construction where you require 3 bids, correct?
Well, it does. Yep, but maybe let's hold off on that discussion until we start talking through the methodologies and the dollar amounts. Yep, I'll just kind of table that one, but that's a good question. Yep. Because I think I get what you're going at. And so when you're considering if you're working with a general contractor, right, there should be kind of a bidding or proposal process as to which contractor you use. Now, how they kind of divvy out their purchases amongst then that does not necessarily fall in those thresholds. But again, sorry,
Yeah,
no, I didn't.
it's a very deep question, right? Like the value of our acquisitions and contracts are a lot higher than most of the single family stuff. So we play in a different field.
Got it. Okay, yep, let's talk about that when we maybe get to the methodologies. That'll be a good conversation. All right, talking about, again, some procurement requirements. It says organizations must award contracts only to responsible contractors. Right, so really, what's a responsible contractors? Well, it's one that possesses the ability to perform successfully under the terms and conditions of a proposed procurement. Right, so consideration should be given to matters such as contractor integrity, compliance with public policy, record of past performance, and financial and technical resources, right? Are they really going to be able to fulfill those terms and conditions of that proposed procurement? So this really comes back into play when you're considering, which vendor do we end up selecting? Is it the price? Is it their past performance? And really here's where it's saying, well, it does need to be a responsible contractor. So yes, price needs to be considered, but all these other things too need to be considered when deciding which vendor is going to be used. One second here. Okay, and I like to bring this up during this discussion of responsible contractors, right? Maybe some of you are familiar with the suspension and debarment check that needs to be done for vendors. Now, the requirement, the regulation, comes from 2 CFR 180. It just states that you need to make sure that the vendor is not suspended or debarred when you enter into a contract for over $250,000. So you need to make sure that the government, that they haven't excluded them as being a vendor that you can use on contracts with federal funds. So you can either do a check on the excluded parties list system. That's what that EPLS stands for. Currently at www.sam.gov, and I'm actually going to pull that up here after I go through this slide. So you can either do the check. Yes.
Rebecca, you said that it was over 250,000, but on the slide it says 25,000.
I'm sorry. I had that stuck in my mind. Thank you. Thank you for clarifying that. Yes, $25,000. Yes. Very important clarification there. Yes, it's when the contract over $25,000. So you can either go and do the check, which I'll show you how quick and easy that is, or you can technically add in the clause in the procurement contract that essentially says, by signing this agreement, you are certifying that no principal parties in your entity are suspended or debarred. Now, best practice is kind of to do both. But in some cases, you might not enter into a kind of a formal contract when they would be signing that. And so in that case, you definitely should be doing a check on the EPLS site. The important thing here is, like always, is to keep documentation. This is an area that when I used to do single audits, we'd see all the time. I truly believe the organizations were doing the check, but they weren't keeping any record of it. They weren't doing a print screen showing the results. And so as an auditor, unless you see it, it really didn't happen. So this is something you need to make sure that in your procurement processes, you have a way of capturing that check being done. Or of course, if you have the clause in the procurement contract, you would need to keep that contract. Now, I say best practice is really to do this on every procurement with federal funds for 2 reasons. One, I'll show you how kind of quick and easy it is. You'll see how probably easy it is to incorporate in your processes. But also, if you're referring back to that previous slide where it talks about response.
Oops. Uh-oh.
Rebecca, if you could hear us, you froze. Andrea, she cut out.
Oops. I say give it a second. It happens every once in a blue moon. You get a freeze. See if she can join us back in here in a moment. While Rebecca's joining us, yeah, that point she's making about the checking of the contractors for suspension and debarment over any contracts 25,000 and over. Yeah, that's something as a lesson learned we did years ago in Georgia. We were doing the check, and if it's not documented, it never happened, that old saying. And so we changed our process and made sure that we printed out every single one of our subgrantees, made sure that we checked on them since they were all getting contracts worth more than 25,000, and made sure that they did the same with their contractors. I think I see. Okay. Well, Rebecca, I can resend the video link. Okay. So. There we go.
All right. That was interesting. All I had to do is go up to the web browser and hit enter to refresh it. So I don't know what happened there. Sorry, everyone.
Well, we're almost there.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
Hey, that was quick. Well, at least you didn't have a tornado flying over your house or something crazy. So all's good.
Very odd that happened. I apologize for that. So I'm not sure kind of where I cut off. But essentially I was saying, that the vendor not being suspended or debarred really to me falls into this responsible contractor definition. And I have seen an awarding agency clearly state that they expect their grantees to be doing this check on all of their vendors, and they reference back to this requirement here. All right, so I'm going to pull up the www.sam.gov. My screen.
As you pull that up, Rebecca, I have a question. I've done this search on just tons and tons of contractors, and I've never seen it come back with anybody debarred. So I'm guessing that's rare, but it's out there. I'm wondering if anybody knows what it would look like when that shows a debarment or a problem with the contractor. That
is a great point you bring up, and I actually always pull up an example of one that is, so you can see that you can see. Yep. So the SAM.gov, if anyone's been on it yet, they're trying to make it kind of the one-stop shop, if you will, for kind of all things grant related. So it does have things like the assistance listings, which I'll just make a quick note. Perhaps many of you are familiar with the term CFDA, the Catalog of Federal Domestic Assistance. That's what they used to call the numbering system. Now, as far as where the funding is coming from, which agency, was the prefix, the last three numbers kind of dictated the program it was from. Now they just call them assistance listing numbers, right? So if you see that on any agreement that you might have, Really, CFDA is a thing of the past. It should just say assistance listing. However, I think just like A133, people might have emotional ties to it or whatever it might be. I don't think CFDA will probably ever go away. In fact, I still see it on some awarding agencies, like within their own guidance. They haven't gotten the memo, I guess, yet, that it's just assistance listing number. But if you kind of see either one of those, it's again, kind of interchangeable. Let's see. So the exclusions are under the entity information. So you can click on that. Now, this again is a kind of a newer site. I think it came out 3 years ago now. They added this functionality, I should say, to the site. The old site, it was like epls.gov. I much preferred that one because it would show what the entity that you put in. So it's probably easier if I just give an example here. It would show that, yes, Clifton Larson Allen is an active registrant with the government, and they are not excluded or suspended or debarred. Now it just really gives you a results if there is a hit, which then makes you wonder, did I type it in wrong? Did I, put it exactly how they registered? It's pretty intuitive in that, if it has at least one keyword or something, it kind of pulls it into its search. So now it kind of just makes the documentation of the search a little more tedious in that, typically I would say, do a print screen showing that I searched for Clifton Larson Allen and there was no matches found, right? Whereas before it said Clifton Larson Allen, not suspended or debarred, a little clearer. So again, it's just usually I'd like to do a print screen to show that, yep, we checked it and they are not on there. Now, an example of what it would look like if an entity was, here's where it would say exclusion, right? And their termination, it would, of course, give their address. That gives you a good idea of, yep, we have the right vendor here. Termination date. This Patricia, she is excluded forever. So is Linda. So they must have done pretty bad stuff. So, this is what it would look like. It would show you here.
So, Rebecca, once somebody's disbarred, can they be in good standings? Can they come back and be undisbarred?
I think at some point debarred might be the ones kind of forever. Suspended might be for a period of time. Yep. And the key is, because that question comes up, is how often kind of do I need to be doing these? And let's stop sharing my screen here. The regulation, again, if you go back to the 2 CFR 180, it says when you enter into a contract, right? It kind of even says, hey, if they become suspended or debarred after you sign that contract, that's not really on you to keep checking back over and over and over. But again, I think best practice is to do this whenever you enter into a new procurement transaction. At the very least, when you are using a new vendor, right? Hey, we've never procured with Patricia Larson before. We should probably, go check her out. Some entities like to do it. So I'd say at least when you enter into a new relationship with a vendor, right, that you're procuring with. Some entities then like to say, hey, on an annual basis, we're just going to go through our list, just check them again, right? Just to make sure that they haven't become suspended or debarred. I think that's a great best practice too. Again, the regulation doesn't necessarily require that, but because it is so quick and easy to do, I really recommend putting it within your procurement processes. Again, at the very least, when you enter into a new procurement transaction, and then if you can kind of do an annual recheck, that's definitely recommended too.
And Rebecca, there's a question that came in the chat from Rich. Just how bad do you have to be for you to get disbarred as a vendor?
That is information I am not as privy to. I'm not sure. I think there's information out there on how you become suspended or debarred.
I didn't know if it was a tax collection issue or, because sometimes I know this from government procurement in the past is that if you owe tax dollars to the federal government, you cannot receive a grant from the federal government.
Yeah, that's a good. That might be a different classification, if you will, for lack of a better term, as to I think suspended or debarred, you have to be mostly out of compliance, because there is something, if you dig into the uniform guidance in the remedies for non-compliance section, one of them kind of does refer to, you know, if it's pretty egregious, you know, you can reach out to your awarding agency to start the suspension or debarment kind of inquiry and process. So I think it would be, that's more like non-compliance or misuse of funds or fraud or abuse versus late tax payment, right? So I think that's a different classification, but could still hold you up, absolutely, from receiving, you know, federal financial assistance. Whereas this is more on the procurement side, right? Can you procure with them as a vendor?
Got another question. So I'm not sure if you know this, but we have weatherization readiness funds, which is new this year. And what that means is the agencies are doing jobs that are larger than they've ever done before. And there are also needs for things like roof replacements in rural New Mexico, where we might only get one bid received from a contractor. So if this roof replacement happens to be more than 25,000, that contractor may not be used to working with the federal government, and they're not going to have a DUNS number. So I noticed that it says should be, we should check on them with SAM.gov. Would that fall under not only a sole source procurement, but would we be able to not require that contractor to register and use that contractor? And then the other question would be, if we did a search on SAM.gov and something comes back as no records, that doesn't really tell us that they have registered or not. There's just no records. They're kind of related.
Right. Yep. So actually, so an entity is required to register and get an active SAM.gov registration if they are a prime contractor with the federal government, right? Or if they are a prime recipient on a federal financial assistance, you know, either to even to apply, you know, for federal funds, you need to have that active registration. As well as then subrecipients too. They need to, at the very least, obtain a DUNS number, or I'm sorry, that's old terminology, a UEI number. So in your situation of, you know, that roofing company, they may not need to have a SAM.gov registration, right? If they're not ever seeking to get to be a prime contractor from the federal government. So you're right, that this is one thing where it's kind of, well, then what other aspects of that vendor should we be considering to see if they are responsible, right? But you bring up a really good point. Not every vendor may be on there, but you do need to at least do the check in the event that they are on there and that they've been suspended or debarred. But if it's in a case where you would expect them to be on there, well, then you might, you know, want to look a little further. Have them perhaps show you. I've actually had clients do that where they said, okay, we're going to have all of our, in that case, it was subrecipients, you know, go to SAM.gov, show us a printout showing that their registration is active. So they have it for their records.
Thank you.
Yep. And I think, again, at the very least, if you are entering into a formal contract, right, it still doesn't hurt to have that clause in there to get them to certify that they're not suspended or debarred. Okay, and then I get the question a lot of, okay, so we've chosen our contractor, you know, now what kind of oversight or monitoring do we need to do on that contractor, right? And really the regulations just say entities must maintain oversight enough to ensure that contractors perform in accordance with the terms, with the conditions, and the specifications of their contracts or purchase orders. So that's going to vary, right? Depending on what it is you're procuring. If it's a delivery of a good, well, that's going to be pretty straightforward, right? Did they give it to us on time and in good condition? If it's a service that they're providing, you know, maybe you need a little more oversight to say, you know, are they providing this service in the manner that we really expected of them? So it really will depend, again, on what it is that you're procuring as to what kind of oversight you need to have on that contractor. Okay, I mentioned competition. and how the uniform guidance really stresses the importance of it. So it does say that all procurement transactions must be conducted in a manner providing full and open competition. And some situations that the uniform guidance considers to be restrictive of competition include things like placing unreasonable requirements on firms in order for them to qualify to do business, right? It's kind of really over and above what is needed for them to, you know, successfully provide that good or service and what you need, you know, to accomplish your program objectives. Requiring unnecessary experience, perhaps, and excessive bonding, right? If it's not really necessary, then requiring that would be, again, you might be kind of whittling out some potential vendors. Non-competitive pricing practices between firms or between affiliated companies. Non-competitive contracts to consultants that are on retainer contracts. Again, that wouldn't really allow you to kind of consider that full population. Organizational conflicts of interest, we talked through that. Specifying only a brand name product instead of allowing, you know, that brand name or equal product to be offered, as well as describing the performance or other relevant requirements of the procurement. We'll kind of talk through that one a little later. And then it says in any other arbitrary action in the procurement process that might limit the competition. So again, they really want to make sure that you're considering as many different possible vendors as possible.
Hey, Rebecca.
Yes.
A question about competition and vendors selections. Like when the providers issue out their procurement packets and they come to a vendor that has no experience with a procurement package or you know, even know what it is, but they want to apply for you know, for work or whatever. Is there a rule against the provider helping them with the packet?
I would say, as far as, if I hear what you're asking, you know, if they give you 3 out of the 5 pieces of information you asked for, you know, if you have to go back to them and say, hey, could you also provide, you know, bios or whatever it is, the missing information, I don't think that correspondence really inhibits it. If it's actually, you know, assisting them documenting something, then yeah, I think it's crossing over that line. Is it more the first situation where you just are asking, can we kind of guide them in compiling the information?
Thank you, Rebecca. David had to step out for a second. We typically have FAQs where all the questions are produced and answered publicly, so everybody's on an even playing field. And we also have a training where the questions are asked kind of like this. So it's in a group setting, and people can hear the questions and hear the answers and have the opportunity to ask more questions. And then we have a silent period between, and this is for procurement with our subgrantees, of the people that are in the room now. That same thing is not happening with the contractors and vendors because we're not, I guess this is not really happening. So I'm not sure if David's question was meaning with us between the subgrantees or the contractors, but I suppose the way I'm thinking through it is it would be, if you're doing something that makes it uneven to your competitors, then that would probably be something that we can get in trouble for. But if you're providing the answer and the training for everybody equally, then we're good. Would that be correct?
Absolutely. Yep. Yep. And as Andrea put in the chat there, right? If everyone has the same opportunity to respond and be involved with that training, then you are not limiting it by any means. No, and that's pretty, I see that quite often with different RFP situations that I know that CLA responds to, right? The questions are due at a certain time. We have a kind of open Q&A. It is absolutely allowable. Mm-hmm.
Thank you. I'll relay that to David when he gets back.
Okay. All right. I wonder, should we just break 5 minutes early so that David doesn't miss out on kind of the next 5 minutes of content. That sound reasonable to everyone?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that sounds good. And if we come back right at the top of the hour and get right into the next section of it, I think this is probably a good stopping point.
Perfect.
Yeah.
All right. Well, everyone enjoy their break, and like Kendra said, we'll meet back at the top of the hour.
Okay, sounds good. See you in just a bit.
You know,
We did. And it got, yeah, yesterday was just there.
it's fine. I just wanted to.
We did send that email, yes. And just do exactly what you're doing now. If I see I don't have anything lit up, and I usually mark it as unread and I don't answer it, but sometimes the things get so insane. I'll see it and it'll.
And if there is snacks and stuff, we'll hear it now.
Thanks, David.
All right.
So you asked that yesterday, was it?
It might have been yesterday, yeah.
There it is. Well, I thought I answered that question.
Did you?
Yeah.
That's possible too.
Yes. Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, the answer would be yes. Wait a minute. I did not answer it, and the answer is yes.
Let me mute it.
David, are your folks back from their break?
Yes, we could go ahead and get started. I think we're just lacking Dimitri.
Okay, okay. We'll wait for Rebecca to get back on, and then did you want to do the introductions with your director? Okay.
She's asking us if we want to.
Yeah, I nodded.
Oh, okay.
So I gotta ask Rebecca when she gets back if there's a minute difference on the top of the hour in Minneapolis. Because I know it's an hour at least, right? They're mountain. Are they an hour? They're an hour behind.
Yeah.
Or an hour.
It gets so confusing. I tell you, sometimes we have Brits in Pacific, Jonathan's in Mountain, Kai's in Central, and I'm in Eastern. All right.
Okay, I think we're ready to get started, but I just wanted to take a few seconds to everybody that's in the chat. We have a new member to the weatherization program and MFA as a whole. We would like to introduce our new community development director, Kelly Tillerson. Kelly is present in the room and she is right here.
Hi.
Hi.
I'm Kelly Tillerson. I am the new community development director. I don't like to say replacing Gina Bell, but stepping into her former role. I've been here about 3.5 weeks and I've learned a whole lot from this team about weatherization, and I'm eager to learn every little detail. So
good to meet you. And you've got a great team out there in New Mexico.
I agree.
Thank you, guys.
Thanks.
Thank you, Kelly.
Awesome, Kelly. All right, well, hopefully everyone had a good break. I'm ready to dive right back in to fund procurement requirements. All right, so one of the requirements is that non-federal entities, so grantees or sub-grantees.
Rebecca, you're not sharing your screen yet.
Thank you, thank you.
Yeah, you bet.
All right, hopefully all good now. All right, yeah, so grantees and sub-grantees must take all necessary affirmative steps to assure that minority businesses, women's business enterprises, and labor surplus area firms are used when possible. Now, this is changed, the terminology from the old circular, where it just says steps should be taken basically when they can. Here, they inserted the word must, so you must take those steps to assure that they're used when possible. Again, they're just saying this should be another consideration, but you should be ensuring that these types of businesses and enterprises are included within your vendor population, and that you're reaching out to them and considering them as a possible option for a vendor.
Rebecca, could I ask a quick question?
Mm-hmm.
In your RFPs or RFQs that you issue, if you mention, some preference given to small and minority and women-owned businesses, and in your scoring section within your RFP, you offer, I don't know, another 5 points if they, meet this, does that kind of check the box for ensuring the affirmative steps?
I think it's a good practice, or I mean, it is something that you can include in your scoring. That element, I don't think is something that's required, right? You don't have to give necessarily preference.
Mm-hmm.
It is it would be more a step ahead, right? Of, okay, if we're sending this RFP out to 5 different vendors, let's make sure that at least one of them, right, meets the definition of one of these businesses. So it's kind of more getting them involved from the beginning versus necessarily giving them preference.
Mhm.
Then answer the question.
Mhm.
All right, so, and I'm just gonna kind of run through what the definition of a labor surplus area firm is. So on an annual basis, the Department of Labor looks around the United States, says, okay, where are some geographic areas that have a higher unemployment rate than the national average, right? So they have a surplus of labor available. So that is what that labor surplus area means. So a firm would be a business, you know, within that geographically designated area. Again, that is designated by the Department of Labor, and it is updated on an annual basis. All right, so affirmative steps, and this comes right from the uniform guidance, must include things such as placing those qualified small and minority businesses and women's business enterprises on your solicitation list. So again, like I mentioned, if you're reaching out to 5, making sure that you have at least one of them that meets that definition if possible. Assuring that small and minority businesses and women's business enterprises are solicited whenever they are potential sources. Perhaps dividing total requirements. Again, it says when economically feasible into smaller tasks or quantities to permit maximum participation by small and minority businesses and women's business enterprises. So if you have an RFP out there and there's maybe 3 different elements, and there's perhaps not a small and minority business or a women's business enterprise that could perhaps provide all 3 services, but you know that there's one that could probably be really good at one of those 3. Again, maybe consider breaking that procurement out then to allow maximum participation. Now, this is an area where it does say when economically feasible, right? They're not saying, well, if you're going to have to spend more, just kind of for the sake of using a business that meets that definition, they're not saying that it's not an absolute requirement, right? We don't expect you to pay more, but when economically feasible, when it makes sense, when you can, you know, they're suggesting that you go ahead and consider if you should break that out. Using the services and assistance as appropriate of such organizations as a Small Business Administration, the Minority Business Development Agency, of the Department of Commerce. On the next slide, I have some links to some really great sites where you can find different vendors. And then requiring the prime contractor, if subcontracts are to be let, to also take affirmative steps, right? So if you're contracting out for a service, and if you think that contractor, you know, is also going to maybe subcontract under them, or regardless if you think or not, you just need to let them know that they also need to be taking affirmative steps. All right, so the Small Business Enterprises, there's a great website here where you can search by NICS code. I'm actually going to go ahead and pull this up again because this is a very easily usable, if you will, resource. Let's see if. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and just share a new screen here. It'll just take a second. I'm actually curious if anyone on the training today, has anyone used a site such as this or something similar to help navigate and to find vendors that qualify? Or if there's other sites too, if other people say, oh yeah, those are great, but you know, we also have this other one, maybe there's one specific to New Mexico or to your geographic area. The resources like this, I think, are really great to kind of share amongst each other.
Yeah, this is the first time I've seen this, Rebecca.
Okay.
Yeah.
Good. Yep. So again, you can search by, you know, by state. Let's go into New Mexico. I think you can select one state, then press lookup. Oh, there you go, there's the lookup. All right, the site itself is a little rudimentary, but it gets the job done, and it is a great resource. All right, give me a county.
Bernalillo.
Okay. Oh, yeah. Number one, there we go. Oops. Okay, and then here it actually, you know, you're able to say you want it to be within these minority owned, any self-certified women-owned business. Let's go with that route. All right, and then next code. So that is, what does it stand for? National, kind of industry. I know the I is industry. I had it memorized at one point. Basically, you know, if you need someone to help provide accounting services or general contractor services or roofing services, right? So there's different industry codes. Here, I think you can go, ooh. I don't know if they'd be doing that. Steal my information. All right, I'll get out of that one. All right, we'll just do any next code. We want to know all of them, right? All right, and there we want to narrow it down though to the nature of business to construction. All right, I think there's some other kind of search thing, but let's just search using that criteria. Right, and here you go. All right, so we searched on women's owned businesses, right? And so you can get kind of a list right in that geographic area. In the county, that qualifies as a women-owned business. So like I said, really easy to navigate through to get a list where you can kind of look through either that, look through further and say, yep, we should, you know, this one looks like a good contender. We should include them on our solicitation list. And I think, let me see if you actually click on a name where it takes you. Oh, here we go. It actually takes them to their SBA profile, right? And then of course you can go to their website and check them out even further. So again, really kind of easy way to quickly get to a listing. And I'm gonna go back, see if I can click on. I wonder what you guys are, yep, so you guys clicked through here too. So this is also from the Small Business Administration. This is minority owned, just minority owned and women's owned business directory. Right, so here you can, if you know the company name, just want to know further information about them, or search by industry. This one is a little bit easier to get to the industry, let's say fishing. All right, this one isn't necessarily as geographically focused. Oh, you can, we just focus on all the industry, right? I think there's also, you could do it by state. So we could have narrowed it down. So is there any minority owned or women's business owned? I guess you can't do both. You know, I'm learning about this one. You can't do industry and state. It's either state or industry. So again, just another good resources to get you to the information on a pretty quick basis. All right, I'm actually gonna share my screen again. All right, and then the labor surplus area firms too. So here's a website. Actually, I don't know that one's really, it's actually spits it out in a Excel document as far as the list. So you go to that site, there's a link, related links that says latest issue of labor surplus area firms. I believe it's on a calendar year basis, so it would say like 2023 or whatever the latest time frame would be. And then then you download a spreadsheet, I believe. So again, really kind of quick and easy, a couple clicks to get there. All right, so this is a subsection that's talking about domestic preferences for procurements. So some of you may be familiar with the Buy American Act, which is not the same thing, but it's something very related. That became an act back in the 1930s that actually requires for any construction on a publicly used land that you need to buy goods that are produced in the United States. Now, with the Buy American Act, that is very clear within your grant agreements and the terms and conditions if that is applicable. This one is kind of I'll say it a little scaled back, but kind of in the same spirit, right? It's people refer to it as a Buy America, right? And it says that as appropriate and to the extent consistent with the law, the non-federal entity, so the grantee or sub-grantee, should, to the greatest extent practicable under a federal award, provide a preference for the purchase, acquisition, or use of goods, products, or materials produced in the United States. And it even lists out including but not limited to things like iron, aluminum, steel, cement, and then just and other manufactured products. Another reason why I bolded here, greatest extent practicable, is because when this was a revision to the uniform guidance in 2020, and before those revisions were actually issued, they had a number of different proposed ones, and they asked firms within the industry to comment back on them. And so on behalf of the CLA, I put together some comments, and I asked regarding this one, I said, what exactly is meant by greatest extent practicable? How are awarding agencies going to, or what are they going to expect from their grantees? Is there going to be some kind of documentation that they're going to be looking for? Kind of what should grantees expect as to how to be in compliance with this? Because it's pretty vague, right? Greatest extent practicable. And they actually just replied back, TBD. I guess they just thought the awarding agencies would kind of figure it out. So to me, I read this as this is another consideration, right? If it makes sense, if it is feasible to buy American-made products, I think then go ahead and do that. I always refer back to that economical purchase, right? Now, if you're going to be spending more to get products that are produced in the United States, now again, that's just another consideration, right? Here, I don't see it. It's not an absolute requirement. It's just a consideration, something that should be kind of within your procurement analysis. All right, for purposes of kind of what that subsection means, produced in the United States means, I guess, for iron and steel products, that all manufacturing processes from the initial melting stage through the application of coatings occurred in the United States. So kind of specific about that as it relates to iron and steel products. All right, we've got an example here from Troy that I'll read out. It says, maybe an example will be when there is an appliance that is assembled in America, but not every component of that appliance is. Right, so Troy's given an example of when, I just want to make sure that that was more of a statement than a question, but yep, you know, as much as you can, right. So if it was assembled, if the materials, kind of course they would like the whole thing to be done in the United States. It's kind of what the spirit, I think, of this subsection is that the previous administration had put in here. But I think to your point, yep, if it can include either the materials or the assembly, right? Kind of as much as possible being done here in the United States is what they're going for. Okay, now all the fun stuff, digging into the procurement methodologies. All right, so the uniform guidance allows for different procurement methodologies depending on the procurement transaction amount. And I really like to specify, even before I dig into these different thresholds and what the requirements are, is when you're considering what threshold am I even in, or what kind of bucket, what methodology do I need to follow? How do I figure out what that dollar amount is? Is it per unit cost? Is it how much I've spent with a vendor over a period of time? And it really is based on what is the procurement transaction amount? How much was a single total purchase for? Kind of regardless of how much was charged to the grant, actually. Again, now this is only applicable if a portion of it, if a portion or if all of it is charged to the grant. That's when you need to follow federal procurement. But sometimes organizations will purchase, let's say 20 laptops. And in the end, 1 or 2 of them are actually going to a federal program, but it was more economical to buy all 20 together, right? Well, because even a portion of it was charged to a federal award, you actually end up looking at, well, what was the whole transaction amount? And truly, that's then the methodology that needs to be followed. You don't necessarily carve out the 2 laptops themselves are $5,000, so we're at $5,000. You look at the whole transaction. Because again, the government wants to make sure that for the total amount that was purchased, the totality of it was the right methodology followed to make sure, again, that you're getting the best economical purchase or use the best, the most responsible vendor that was advantageous to the program. All right, and it's also irregardless of how many transactions with vendors that occurred during a period of time. That's an often misconception of, oh boy, well, we've purchased 5 times for the vendors, so now we're over the 10,000. Oh shoot, now we should have been getting 2 quotations, or even now we're over the 250,000. Oh boy, we should have gone out for an RFP. And that doesn't trigger it. It's again, just the one procurement transaction amount.
Rebecca?
Yes.
This is an area that we could explore a little bit more. Would you please elaborate, just if you don't mind, take a minute to elaborate on that last thing that you just said, to be a little bit more clear?
About the transactions with vendors? It really goes into when you're considering, am I in the micro purchase over the simplified acquisition? These 5 different methodologies that we'll talk through, you really just look at that one-time transaction, right? How much should we procure for this one transaction? So it might become a little clearer here if I go through an example. So let's say you purchase 10 laptops and they're each $2,500 each on January 1st from the vendor, right? So that total transaction is $25,000. Well, now you're in the small purchase methodology, which we'll talk through what that means. And those are the requirements that you would need to follow for that transaction. Well, then let's say you purchased an additional 3 laptops for $2,500 each on February 1st from the vendor. So now your total transaction is $7,500, right? Well, now you're still in the micro purchase. So we'll talk through what that means, but you're now subject to that requirement, right? So you'd be looking at each procurement transaction versus, instead of, well, now we've spent $32,000 with the vendor. What does that mean, right? It doesn't kind of add on to each other. So each procurement is considered differently against which methodology is needed.
And I'm just curious, I feel like this was a confusing point, Troy, even for some of the DOE project officers. I feel that when I was in a WAP manager role, I was counseled by my DOE PO that what Rebecca's saying, where several different transactions would not be added up from that same vendor and then considered as a different purchase, they were kind of saying, yes, it is. And if you're going to buy, 5 laptops in 6 months, you should kind of know that you're going to do that, and you should do the procurement methodology as such, which at least for me, I thought it was kind of confusing. So it's good to hear. I think sometimes the guidance can get a little confusing around it. Is that part of the reason maybe you were asking, Troy, or did you have other reasons for that?
Yeah, it's similar. Well, it's not laptops, but we're thinking multifamily would be project by project. So based on what we're looking at here. So the one project for one contractor being less than $250,000 would be still under the small purchase methodology. And for single family, one contractor, project by project is a little bit more confusing because that would be house by house. So then we might get into an aggregate time period. So would that be the case, or would that still be house by house?
So that's a great question. So you kind of think about what the transaction includes, right? So to Andrew's comment about how the, DOE rep kind of mentioned, well, what you estimate you're going to procure with it. Now, sometimes you do enter into more of a procurement relationship, right? Like for that contractor, you don't need to procure with each project by project. Maybe it does include kind of multiple ones, but you think about what are we procuring? Are we procuring them to work on 3 projects, right? Well, and now if you're over the 250, then yep, you need to follow that, right? It doesn't need to be, the transactions don't need to be like singularized, that's not a word, but right, it can cover a number of different aspects. And if it's more of sometimes it's even a relationship, right? We're going to procure an office supply vendor. We don't know what we're going to purchase during the year, but we know that they've quoted us a stapler is this amount, paper is this amount, right? And we can reach out to them and we can get those goods for that dollar amount because we procured into that relationship at the beginning, right? And then that, if you get into that situation, it is more of an estimate of how much do we think that we're going to spend, right? But if you're entering into a relationship like that, you're probably already going through the steps of a formal procurement, right? Okay, Staples, how much would you pay? Office Max, how much would you, quote us? So you're probably already meeting the requirements, kind of regardless of the dollar amount. But I do like to bring that up is sometimes it's a relationship that you're entering into, in which case then it does become more of an estimate.
Okay, that's helpful. That makes sense because in the state plan that the state of New Mexico files with the Department of Energy, they estimate how many units they're going to do in a year. And then, most often those then flow down into the subcontractor agreement. So maybe you have 2 subcontractors, each is on the hook to do 100 units a year. You would know what is expected, at least when you're going into an RFP or a procurement transaction. So I guess to Troy's question about, do you look at each house, which would often be under the $25,000 level, right? Because some people have asked that question too. As a subgrantee, do I have to go, every year and procure my contractors that do the work?
And to me, so you have the ability to kind of define that relationship with what you're procuring, right? So what kind of triggers it in my mind is, could you switch to a different vendor, right? If for, housing project A, you use vendor A, housing project B, you might consider using a different vendor. That's not the case. If you have a go-to vendor that you're going to use, then to me, again, that's the relationship that you procured, right? And so in that case, then you want to think about in totality, what are these different housing projects that would probably, reach out to that contractor for? Sounds like, like you were saying with the plans, it might already be somewhat defined. So that to me would be kind of the transaction that would determine, do we need a formal procurement? Do we just need the 2 rate quotations? Things of that nature. It really does, in my mind, when could we possibly switch vendors, right? And that kind of, to me, would be the end of the procurement transaction. Hopefully that helps clarify a little bit. And then as far as the timing of when that procurement relationship, or even if you enter into a formal contract, how long can that be? The regulations don't really specify. I remember I had one client that when they found out, or when we were talking through this procurement, like, oh, I'm just going to start entering into 5-year contracts all the time. So I only have to do it once every 5 years. Well, I guess the regulations don't prohibit that, right? It depends on what he was actually talking about, auditing services, but it depends on what the good or service is, right? And really, could you still justify that you're getting the most economical purchase kind of throughout the life of that agreement? If so, if you're saying, yeah, I'm pretty sure for the next 5 years, this would still be a really good price, the most advantageous to the program, well, then I think you can justify entering into a contract that long. Actually, the example is that he said it 10 years. Right, so you have to just put that into consideration too, of is the length of this relationship or contract that we're entering into, could we still justify that it makes sense, give you an economical approach, advantageous for the program? So just want to mention that too.
Yeah, I got a question quick before you move on. With this, if we're working at different properties, right? They're multifamily apartments. They've got 100 units and there's 6 of them. If we're using vendor A to quote property A, or 6 vendors that we send quotes to, right? And it just so happens the most cost-effective one throughout all the bids is the same vendor. As long as everything's documented, each contract for each property is going to be a standalone, correct?
It can be. I think, again, the regulations don't necessarily specify, or I should say the uniform guidance doesn't specify that your procurement transaction needs to be siloed to just what you're directly charging to a grant program. It can cover multiple different grant programs. It can cover a grant program and not grant program activities, right? As long as you can correctly identify the accurate amount to charge back to a, that one specific project or grant, your transactions can expand further than that.
Okay.
Now, again, I don't know from a kind of legal standpoint, does it make sense to have a contract agreement for each project? Again, that might make sense. I can't really speak to that, but the regulations themselves.
That's the problem we're faced with, right? Because is a negotiated proposal acceptable? Where we collect data from multiple agencies and they say, here, look, a 40,000 BTU furnace is going to cost $980 and a 60,000 is going to be $1,200. The only difference might be that's for material only, right? So that's the material cost. And then the labor, depending on the property, is going to be individual issues, right? So they're all going to come with a stipulation. So if their equipment price is the best off the bat, can we partner with a qualified vendor to do multiple properties and provide the services if there are different stipulations at each property?
That's an interesting situation. Do they at least give you kind of ranges of what?
Yeah, what we would do is like the Ashray thing, right? They're pretty much solid. It's going to be pretty much a standard furnace installation is going to cost, I don't know, $2,500. If we do that across the board, right, and they are the most cost-effective option, and we negotiate this price with 3 or 4 vendors, right, in the community that we determine are qualified, can we create a fixed price contract with these guys with multiple contractors at a time to work on different properties? Is that something that's legal, or is that something that's kind of getting into the weeds and not best practice?
So what I heard you say last was you'd have multiple fixed price agreements. Did you say with different vendors,
right,
different contractors?
We would do, like in New Mexico, we would get 6 vendors to quote on a negotiated proposal, right? Mm-hmm. And we would determine based on that what would be an equitable bid. And then we could say, okay, here's our negotiated proposal. Here's our pricing for these units. Do you agree to work for this price based on the data we collected, right? And then we could say, okay, this is what we're going to pay for a 40,000 BTU furnace. And then we could select from qualified vendors to do that project rather than having to bid $2 million worth of projects every year.
Yeah, I think, again, you'd want really good documentation. You're right, because there's nothing that prohibits you from kind of negotiating back, right? In fact, when we talk about procurement records, that's one of the elements is basically how did you end up on the price contract that you did, right? Knowing that you might not just accept what they give you, or maybe there's some additional kind of back and forth. So you'd want just really good documentation showing all the different steps, right?
Okay.
That you just described. Now, I'd be interested to know, why did you pick the 3 vendors out of the 6 that you did, right? So you'd need good documentation, a good evaluation process for, all right, well, we're going to, score them in a certain way or evaluate them in whatever manners. We're going to be looking at these factors, right? So that it's very clear as to why you picked the 3 that you did. But otherwise, the process you described to me, that seems reasonable and that it meets the requirements and regulations.
I'm just curious because once we get this proposal collected, if we go this route, and if we were to go this route, not that we are, but if we were, could we, open it up for competition down the road and continue to solicit vendors, right? Hey, look, this is the price that we've negotiated for the state of New Mexico. And we can invite you guys in, right? And maybe, like they were talking about at the conference, train other weatherization professionals, right? Get that smaller minority business in there with that experienced guy. Let him work on some units, maybe one of the buildings of the 12 that we're doing, and let him train up with one of the experienced guys to help build up that professional database that we need, that professional experience. Because if they're all getting paid the same rate, it shouldn't be a problem for them to go out there and shadow somebody. There's no competition on the side at that point, right?
Right. What I'm now struggling is, I think that makes good sense. How would you come down to select the 3?
Well, I wouldn't select 3. I'm talking about selecting set pricing. And then from there, we can open it up for proposal, for competition, right? For them to come in. But with a set price proposal, not so much at selecting just 3 qualified vendors, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it's like, just to make sure I'm understanding too, following you, Rich, it's like you're sending out an RFI to get the pricing on all the materials that you would expect to use. Then you're taking that information and creating from that data that they return to you fair pricing for all the different equipment. Then you're putting that out there in another, like an RFQ for qualified contractors to participate with this equipment at this pricing.
Correct.
Mm-hmm. And so, and because, time is also of the essence, selecting one would be a significant disadvantage to the program, because you may need, you've got 6 units, you may need 6 vendors or more than that to do that. So I just want to make sure I'm following your process and your logic, and yeah,
that's what I'm saying.
Allow for that full and open competition, right? I'm just trying to think through that in my head. Would it be eliminating any potential vendors? But I think if you've already kind of done the market price comparison of, this seems like reasonable for the equipment, the supplies, what you're willing to pay for labor, I think then that would be adequate to say we're not, eliminating any potential vendors here, because we've already kind of done our market research, if you will.
Right. And we would continue to solicit through the year and continue to approach new vendors in this opportunity, right? This is not just, I want to use vendor XYZ. This is a opportunity to fix pricing, to get that small minority owned business on site, to get them trained up, to get them shadowing that guy that already knows it and understands the program. So it's just a thought. Somebody else had mentioned it to me at the conference. That's how they're doing it, through the RFI or negotiated proposal. And then from there, they're using those rates to do that. I just wanted to know what your thought was of that, because it seems like a great deal to me, because then we could just lock our pricing for 2023. This is what we pay. If you want to participate in the program, we'll give you an opportunity, right?
Yep, I think that makes sense. It meets the requirement, and you just touched on a point that I was going to bring up, is you would need a specified time period, right? And so, as you just mentioned, if you're saying this is what we're doing for 2023, or redo it again in 2024, that makes sense, right? That's sometimes where I see organizations get into trouble, is they kind of open-ended contracts or things, it has a start date but no end date, and then they are never kind of going through their procurement process again. They'd say, well, then you really do need a definitive start and end to know, okay, when is that transaction essentially kind of over? So sounds, I think what you described is actually kind of right in the spirit of when the regulations say the vendor that's most advantageous to the program, right? I kind of relate that to the overall processes, right? What's going to be most advantageous to the program in the end? And I think you brought up really good points. Yep, and then Troy pulled out the citation from the uniform guidance about using pre-qualified lists of vendors. It actually says that that's okay, you can do that as long as you have kind of processes in place to revisit, make sure that they're up to date, make sure that again, it's has enough qualified vendors on there so that you're not kind of slimming it down and saying, oh, here's our 2 go-to ones, but they're on a pre-qualified list, right? You just need to make sure that that again has enough, you know, open competition within it. And it does say you cannot preclude any potential bidders, right, just because they're not on your qualified list. Right, you still need to consider whatever they bring forward to you. Now, maybe there's a reason that they're not on your qualified list. Maybe you had already kind of thought of them and said, nah, that's not a reputable firm or whatever it might be. But, you know, if they do come forward to you with a bid, with a quote, it does need to still be considered.
Okay.
A question came in, Rebecca. What is an appropriate amount of time to redo a qualified vendors list?
Yep, I think that's one where you have judgment on. And to be honest, it is an area where I kind of wish the regulations did specify. There is some areas within the uniform guidance where I was like, why didn't you just give us an exact number or date, you know, time frame? Again, I think it is depending on what it is that those pre-qualified vendors are providing, a certain service, right? How often do you reach out to those vendors for different services? At the very least, right, an annual process on an annual basis to take a look at that. Probably semi-annually is what I see most often, right? But again, it could depend on what it is that they're, because I'm sure you have, well, in some cases, there's different lists for different services and different products, right? If it is just one kind of overall encompassing one, then again, it might depend on how often different goods and services are that might have different potential vendors that should be considered. So you have judgment. I'd say at least annual, if not semi-annual, is probably what I'd recommend.
Thank you.
Yep, good question. All right, just going back to kind of that example, right? So in here, in the first slide, in this example, they purchased laptops on 2 different occasions, right? But you might get into that occasion where, well, we know we're gonna be getting multiple different things from this vendor just in different time frames, right? But maybe your purchase order or your contract is for, you know, the set amount. So in this example, maybe you entered into a contract with that vendor for 13 laptops for a total of, you know, $32,500. Happens to be that you needed 10 of them in January, 3 of them in February, right? So in this case, the transaction amount would be the $32,500. So again, kind of thinking about when the time frame of that transaction and when you could have possibly changed which vendor you are using. Okay, so talking about the different methods of procurement, there are 5 of them. And the uniform guidance kind of puts them into 3 categories. You have your informal methods, and within that you have micro purchases, and you have small purchases. We'll go into all of these in a lot further detail here coming up. Then you have your formal procurement methods. That could be either sealed bids or competitive proposals. Then you might be in a situation of having a non-competitive procurement. I mean, and this is, we'll talk through what that means, but it would be when the procurement is over the 10,000. All right, micro purchases. So the micro purchase threshold means the dollar amount at or below which a non-federal entity may purchase property or services using the micro purchase procedures that we'll talk through. All right, and generally the micro purchase threshold for procurement activities administered under federal awards is not to exceed the amount set by the Federal Acquisition Regulation, right? So that's its own codified regulation over at 48 CFR Part 2, Subpart 2.1 to be exact, unless a higher threshold is requested by the non-federal entity. So there are, right now the micro purchase is at 10,000. I'll talk about the ability to raise that higher. But typically organizations would just use the 10,000. This threshold can change. Let's see if I put that, let me go back. It can change. It doesn't, typically I'd be able to say it doesn't change very often. However, if any of you have been following uniform guidance since it came out, it's already changed 2 times. When the uniform guidance came out, it was at $3,000. Shortly thereafter, in a couple months, actually, half a year, it jumped up to $3,500. And now it was raised a couple years ago to $10,000. And that was kind of related to the National Defense Authorization Act, that we're just kind of raised across the board the micro purchase threshold to 10,000. There is some situations where non-federal entities can self-certify and get a higher threshold to use internally. There's very specific situations. In fact, I don't really see it all that often, that I don't even have a slide in here, but the uniform guidance speaks to it, and it says, if you've basically had a clean audit for the last 2 years, if you do an annual kind of internal control assessment on it and see no risk in having a higher one, or if you, for higher education institutions, if it meets in line with state law, that's a very kind of specific situation. Most organizations, because as we talk through what is required for micro purchases, they say, you know what, 10,000 is probably the highest we want to go for this anyways. But if you are interested in kind of exploring further what and when and if it makes sense to get a higher threshold for micro purchases, we can talk through that. So again, so 10,000 and under, right? The only requirements are that you distribute equitably among qualified suppliers. Again, and this is just another consideration, right? Again, kind of going back to that economical purchase and what's the most advantageous. Here's just kind of in the spirit of, hey, if you can spread the love, it's kind of how I describe it, right? If you can use vendor A first time, maybe go to vendor B the next time. If it all kind of makes sense, if the price isn't, you know, too much different, if it's still the same quality, right? To me, it's just another consideration that they're asking you to put into your processes. No quotes are required if the price is considered reasonable, right? So literally you can just go to one vendor and if that price, if you can kind of justify that it's reasonable, that's the only requirement. Which is why it kind of goes back to most organizations don't choose to raise this up higher than 10,000 to say any purchase over 10,000, we're going to want to get at least, you know, 2 rate quotations. So that's just kind of why most organizations will keep it at the 10,000. All right, so what is a reasonable cost? The regulations say that a cost is reasonable if in its nature and amount does not exceed that which would be incurred by a prudent person under the circumstances prevailing at the time the decision was made, right? So if I were to go and purchase that same good or service from that vendor, you know, would Andrea go and do the same thing? The answer is yes, that seems reasonable. Then that really actually meets the definition, right? Would someone else do the same thing in the same situation? Okay. Other kind of, that's kind of to put it simply, right? However, the uniform guidance does go into kind of reasonableness a little further. It says, you know, consideration should be given to whether the cost is of a type generally recognized as ordinary and necessary for the operation of the non-federal entity or the proper and efficient performance of the federal award, right? So it kind of goes back to, is it needed? Is it reasonable? Is it a reasonable purchase? Is it a reasonable price? Right? You can kind of think about reasonableness in 2 different aspects there, but would the organization normally have bought that, you know, to fulfill the program accomplishments? That's kind of one thing that the uniform guidance is very specific about. If you're looking through like cost principles, is making sure that organizations aren't spending more on things just because they have federal funding, or buying things that they normally wouldn't buy, but now they are just because they get federal funding, right? They want to make sure that processes are pretty consistent as to how and when they purchase things, kind of regardless of, is it now being funded with federal funds or not? All right, also consideration should be given to the restraints or requirements imposed by such factors as things like sound business practices, arm's length bargaining, federal, state, local, tribal, and other laws and regulations that might come into play, and then any other terms and conditions of the federal award. I bullet pointed, see here, market prices for comparable goods or services for the geographic area. Again, when you're thinking about micro purchases and the consideration of if the price is reasonable, it's not saying you need to go and do a market comparison for micro purchases. To me, this just kind of comes back to, you have a pretty good sense of if I bought, something at Target, is it going to cost the same as Walmart? Probably a bad example. That's just kind of two that always come into my mind. So again, what a prudent person, they kind of think about what it would be, within the market. Now, when you get into higher methodologies, right, with higher dollar amounts, you're going to get to the point of when you need to do that actual market comparison. For micro purchases, it's just, again, you have a good kind of ballpark, typically. If you don't, then maybe it is worth doing a web search or something further. But the actual requirement is just, that a prudent person would consider it reasonable. All right, consideration should also be given to whether the individuals concerned acted with prudence in the circumstances, considering their responsibilities to the non-federal entity, its employees, where applicable, perhaps as students or membership, the public at large, and the federal government. All right, and then also whether the non-federal entity significantly deviates from its established practices and policies regarding the incurrence of costs, which may unjustifiably increase the federal award's costs. That's kind of going back to that principle that I mentioned before. An example of where I had to bring up this regulation citation to a client is they had a contractor, a consultant, that was doing work for the organization on a regular basis. I think it was more administrative type work, could have been accounting or something similar. Well, in their federal award, and I think they were typically paying this individual $50 an hour, I think was the price or something similar. In the grant application, they had put, let's say accounting services, estimated the price to be $70 an hour. Well, they got the grant. So they said, oh, good. Okay, well, for the time that the individual spends on the grant, we can charge back $70 now and pay her $70. And we really had to look at that and say, but it's the same exact work that she was doing for the non-federally supported activities, right? I think it was accounting, so it was just kind of day-to-day transaction processing. Is it justifiable that now you're paying her $20 more an hour for that work when it really didn't increase her effort? And then we came back to it and said, no, if your contract with her is to pay $50 an hour, then that is what you should be charging to your federal award, kind of regardless of what the grant application kind of signed off on is, right? So this is just an example where you really need to follow the established practices and policies. You can't really change or increase or deviate much just because it's a federal award. Okay, so then I get the question of, all right, well, how do we document, right, that the price is reasonable if that's the only requirement, right? So if your documented procedures, right, state that, well, when our reviewer and approver is looking at the invoice or the purchase order or however they're approving that purchase, right, typically your policies and internal controls would say, oh, they're looking for the allowability of cost, right? That's kind of our internal control over compliance there is person A purchases it, then the program supervisor, whatever it might be, they're going to sign off on that purchase. And that's how they're going to determine, yep, this is an allowable cost to charge the grant. Well, if at that same time you're stating in your internal controls, they're also looking at reasonableness, right? They're kind of looking at two aspects at the same time. Then that in itself, that sign off would satisfy the documentation of, yep, this price was considered to be reasonable. Okay, And to be honest, really, when I think about documentation, so what I just spoke to kind of was as to whether the price was considered reasonable, but really even to support that purchase itself. Right, I have a whole slide on procurement records coming up, and this is a good example of, you know, on that slide it says your procurement record should detail the entire history of the procurement. Well, that sounds pretty robust, but then I also follow it up with, but it really depends on what methodology you're in, right? For micro purchases, it literally might be just an invoice, or a contract, or a purchase order, you know, that supports this is what we purchased from who we purchased. And again, if it has a proper sign-offs, that's all the documentation you would need for that. Okay, now the next methodology, small purchases. So this is when your acquisition is more than that micro purchase threshold of 10,000, but not greater than the simplified acquisition threshold of 250,000. So again, this is something set by the Federal Acquisition Regulation over at 48 CFR. This one, again, usually I say, oh, it doesn't change too much. This one did change from 150,000 up to 250,000, also a couple years ago. I don't foresee this one changing, or the micro purchase threshold. I don't foresee them changing, definitely not in the near future. When these change, it's pretty big. You know, I don't want to say a pretty big deal, but it's things that agencies will push out to you, right? To let you know that when those changes occur. But regardless, currently it is at 250,000. When you're in between those $2 amounts, the only requirement is that you get at least 2 price or rate quotations, right? It says must be obtained from an adequate number of sources. Then it says in the regulation, more than 1. So that leads us to believe you need at least 2. I think, you know, industry best practice is usually typically 3. But again, if you're going back to the regulation, it just says at least 2. These can be as informal as things like a web search, right? I'm looking for 13 laptops, 13 ThinkPads, and then, you know, the results will pop up. Maybe you can scan through those. It could also be a phone call, right? Calling up a vendor, asking them how much, you know, what would your quote be for 13 laptops? Make sure you're writing down who you talked to, what did they quote you? It could be emails, things as informal as that. The key is that you do need to keep all of that documentation, whether it be an email, whether it be a note jotted down, whether it be your web search results. The interesting thing I think about this methodology is that's really the only requirement, is that you get at least 2 price quotations. But it also says, you know, price doesn't need to be the deciding factor. Maybe you picked vendor A because they could get it there quicker, or you thought the quality of their product might be better. Again, you might have different reasons for picking a vendor that was perhaps priced higher. Some situations then you would want to justify, right, why that was. It doesn't need to be lengthy, but if you're keeping those 2 rate quotation documents anyways, jot down, why did you pick vendor B even though they're a little higher? Well, they could get them here, you know, by mid-May instead of the end of May, whatever it might be, so that if your auditor is asking for that documentation, if your awarding agency is asking for that documentation, your pass-through entity, right, you could have it properly justified and kind of have that trail. Again, so you must document that the evidence that the price was considered reasonable, right? So that reasonableness principle, that follows through with any purchase, right? And that the proper number of rate quotations were obtained. Now this one, because you have 2 rate quotations, well then it, you know, it's clear to say, yep, the price was reasonable. Vendor A quoted us $5,000. Vendor B quoted us $5,200, right? Pretty reasonable, pretty much in line. So anyway, but if it is outside of, if it is a phone call, things like that, right? That's where we oftentimes see it missed, is if it is outside of something you have saved on your computer or in your network, you just gotta make sure you scan it and get it in there, or have it available if it's a hard copy. Okay, so now those were the 2 informal procurement methodologies. Now talking about formal procurement methodologies. You have sealed bids is the first one we'll talk about. So procurement by sealed bids are when bids are publicly solicited in a firm fixed price contract, either lump sum or unit price, is typically awarded to the responsible bidder whose bid, conforming to all the material terms and conditions of the invitation for bids, is lowest in price. Again, I think that's kind of a bit of a generality for sealed bids because the regulations do still allow you to pick a different vendor, even if they're not the lowest in price, right? That first clause is awarded to the responsible bidder whose bid is lowest in price. But typically with the bids, price is more of a deciding factor, I'll say. And then in order for sealed bids to be feasible, the following conditions will be present. You need to have a complete, adequate, and realistic specification or purchase description available. There needs to be 2 or more responsible bidders that would be willing and able to compete effectively for the business, right? You should kind of know that ahead of time of putting that sealed bid opportunity out there. The procurement lends itself to a firm fixed price contract, and the selection of the successful bidder can be made usually principally on the basis of price. Those are kind of typical conditions present for the sealed bid procurement.
Rebecca?
Yes.
We had a question in the chat. Can purchase be interchangeable with service?
I'm trying to think of where exactly. So maybe expand more on that, Troy or David. Is there a specific spot in the regulation where it says purchase that you were wondering if it's exchangeable, or is it just as I'm speaking about procurements?
Rebecca, the question is, the regulations are referring to a purchase, and that kind of seems to indicate that tangible material is being used, but the question is more about, can that same concept be applied to a contract or a service when it comes to breaking down the methodology between micro purchases and small purchases and sealed bids?
Oh, absolutely. Yes. And I'm sorry if I didn't clarify that from the beginning. Yes, procurement is on any goods or services procured with federal funds. Yep.
That's what I thought, and that's what I was hoping you would say.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yes. Sorry if I didn't make that extremely clear before, but yep, it could be a service, yep, or tangible good that you're purchasing. Absolutely. Okay, so also with sealed bids, the invitation for bids, which will include any specifications and pertinent attachments, must define the item of service in order for the bidder to properly respond, right? You should have enough information within that bid opportunity where the proposed bidder would really kind of get a good understanding of the specifications of that item or service that they're expected to submit a bid proposal on. Right, and the bids must be solicited from an adequate number of qualified sources, right? So that can be interpreted differently. I'd say industry best practice is for sure 3. Sometimes internally, entities might have a higher number, right? They want at least 5. That's kind of up for interpretation. If you go back to, however, what the requirements are for the informal, right? It said at least 2. I'd say for this one, then you probably want to bump it up at least 1 to get at least 3. You need to provide them sufficient response time prior to the date set for opening the bids, right? You can't expect typically 2 weeks, I'd say, is at least the minimum opportunity for them to submit a bid. Again, it might depend on what it is that you're procuring. But sufficient response time, again, it is a little bit subjective in what you want to kind of put out there. I'd say, again, at least 2 weeks. The invitation for bids will be publicly advertised or need to be publicly advertised for any local and tribal government entities. So that could mean putting something out, local newspaper, posting it on specific websites. If you have kind of your own, external website where it might have a procurement opportunities site on there, That's very common. We say local government clients, really whatever kind of method, or if there's, maybe a Chamber of Commerce that has a procurement opportunity website. Really, however, you can kind of get that publicly advertised and what might make sense for what it is that you're procuring. But that is a requirement for local and tribal governments.
Rebecca?
Yes.
So if a provider opens up a bid or opens up a procurement for any services, and it's open to the public, like putting it in the paper or on their websites, is there a maximum number of applications they can cut off? If just to say they get over 3,000 bids, is there can they cut it off at a certain point? Ooh. Or do they have to accept every bid that comes in for those 2 weeks? Because it could overwhelm the organization.
That is a great question, and one I've never been asked, but I'm going to go back to kind of the full and open competition, right? Requirement that says you can't really preclude bidders from submitting a response. I gotta believe if you say it's going to be open until a certain date, never heard of ever, and I've never heard of it. That doesn't mean it's not out there. Until a certain date or the first 3,000, bids received. I just have never really seen it capped at a number, and I would be hesitant to say that that's acceptable, given again the kind of full and open competition spirit.
I don't think I've ever seen that, even for some small bids. My question is, we'll solicit like 6 vendors, right, for a remote project in a small town, and we'll solicit 6 vendors for requests. Only one responds. I ask for no bids repeatedly, get no response to the no bid inquiries. No one shows up except the one vendor for the sidewalk. He submits a fair and equitable bid based on other projects we've done in the area. What should be our next steps to ensure that we are dotting our I's and crossing our T's to make sure that we are okay to proceed with this vendor?
Yep. So that brings up a great question. I'm actually going to ask if we can just table it until I get to the non-competitive procurement section. Okay. Because that is exactly one of the situations where that's allowed, is if after a number of attempts, basically you only have one firm that has really responded. So I have slides that kind of talk a little more to that, but I think that brings up a really good question. So we'll touch on that in just a bit.
Okay.
Okay. Let's see. So the invitation for bids, which will include any specifications. Oh, no, sorry. We already went over this one. Let me move on to the next one. All right. All bids will be opened at the time and place prescribed in the invitation for the bids. Bids must be open publicly, right? Again, for local and tribal, that's misspelled, and tribal governments. And then where specified in bidding documents, factors such as, if there's any discounts, transportation costs, life cycle costs must be considered, right, and should be named kind of right in that bid response, so that you can determine really which bid is truly lowest in cost. All right, and then a firm fixed price contract award will be made in writing to the lowest responsive and, again, responsible bidder. And then really any or all bids may be rejected if there is a sound and documented reason, right? Okay, so then moving on to the other methodology, once you get over that simplified acquisition threshold of $250,000. Now I will say both with the sealed bids and with the competitive proposals, this is what the uniform guidance, or when I should say, the uniform guidance says it's required, right? When you get to that 250,000, we would expect you to do bids or proposals. That's not to say internally, you might decide that, hey, we're going out for, even a $50,000 purchase. Ooh, we think given what it is that we're procuring, we should probably do a, an RFP with proposals, right? So you always have the ability to lower that. Typically, when I write procurement policies for organizations, right, it'll kind of read to that and say, okay, this is for sure when we get to $250,000, we will do, and list out the methodologies, say, or at a threshold determined by the organization to be lower for that specific procurement, right? And then it really opens it up to, hey, if we think, based on our judgment, if we think we should do an RFP at really any dollar amount, you have that ability. So I just wanted to mention that as well. All right, so this procurement method is where either a fixed price or a cost reimbursement type contract is awarded. I'd say typically, I see with my clients, they're going to do a fixed price type contract. However, in some cases, I have seen a cost reimbursement type contract. All right, and then proposals are generally used when conditions are not appropriate for the use of sealed bids. I'll be honest, usually I see the sealed bid method really only in my state and local government clients. If it's just, if it's a nonprofit organization, typically I'll see them do the RFP and proposals. But that's just, okay, typically I have seen some nonprofits do the sealed bid method. It's really kind of their decision. Now, if you're state and local government, however, and if a state statute is requiring you to do sealed bids, well, then you have to go with that methodology. All right. Again, this is kind of the most common practice for non-governmental entities, unless you are required to do a sealed bid process. All right. So in your solicitation, so within the RFP document, right, it must incorporate a clear and accurate description of the technical requirements for the material, product, or service that is to be procured. It must identify all requirements which the offerer must fulfill and all other factors to be used in evaluating bids or proposals. Right, so again, trying to give the offerers as much kind of information as possible so that they can give you kind of as accurate response back in their proposal. Another thing I'll mention here is, as you can see, it says you need to identify in your solicitation document all the factors that is going to be used in evaluating the bid or proposal. You need to have actually before I go to that one. So let's say if you're going to, you do need to have written evaluation method, which will come up in another slide, saying, what are we going to be looking at these proposals on? We're going to probably be looking at price, record of past performance, maybe their references. What did they report back to them? What is kind of their firm information? The bios of team that will be working on it. Whatever that might be. Again, that's going to be specific to what it is you're procuring and what you're going to be kind of concerned about or wanting to know more about. Those factors actually need to be listed within your RFP documents. Now, oftentimes organizations will use like a weighted scoring method, right? We're going to give 25% to this factor, 25% to this factor. Now, I don't read the regulation to say you actually need to give them those percentages. Oftentimes I'll see that in RFPs myself, where they will let us know as offers what it will be scored on. But I don't think it necessarily has to be in your RFP document, but you do need to at least have the factors listed. All right, and then all solicitations must include a statement of the qualitative nature of the material, product, or service to be procured, and when necessary, must set forth the minimum essential characteristics and standards to which it must conform. All right, so again, giving them kind of as much kind of information as needed so that they can properly respond. All right, and then talking about, that question that I had put in there earlier about when can you use, brand name? Or maybe there's a question coming up. But there's a question in there. And to explain that a little further is, when the regulations say when it is impractical or uneconomical to make a clear and accurate description of the technical requirements, then you could use, a brand name or equivalent description may be used as a means to define the performance or other salient requirements of procurement, right? So if the only way to describe that you're looking for a tablet is to say an Apple iPad, right? But you know, there could be other tablets out there that have the same functionalities, right? They're trying to get you to stay away from even naming the Apple iPad. If you just say we need a tablet that can do X, Y, and Z, that is such and such, you know, processing power, whatever it might be, you know, they would prefer you to leave out any brand names. Because again, not trying to knock out any competition. If there is another product that could still specify and meet your specifications, then they're trying to have you open it up as much as possible. But man, if the only way that you can really get it clear across what you're looking for is to name a brand name, then they're saying, well, at least put or equivalent behind there, right? Okay. Then also, as I mentioned, you know, it does say you must identify all evaluation factors and their relative importance. So some examples of those factors, I already named a couple of these, but it could be price, experience with related projects, the timeline, when they're going to be able to accomplish it, deliverables, references, and whether they're a disadvantaged business enterprise. Okay, as I mentioned before, it must be solicited from an adequate number of qualified sources. I'll mention again, at least 3, you know, is industry best practice. You as an organization must have a written method for conducting technical evaluations of the proposals and how you selected, you know, the vendor that you did. The method really should be developed before you receive the proposals back. Right? So you know that you kind of came up with that methodology and an unbiased method. Maybe it's already a preset one that you use for every single procurement out there. But either way, you should have that defined methodology set before you're starting to receive your proposals back. And then once you go through the evaluation, right, all of that information should be documented so that it ultimately leads to the justification of why you picked the vendor that you did. All right, and then contracts must be awarded to the responsible firm whose proposal is, this is where the regulations say most advantageous to the program, with price and other factors considered, right? So all those other factors that you are evaluated on, they could have different importance. Again, it probably depends on what it is you're procuring. All right, so good documentation for competitive proposals. You need to keep a copy of your RFP that was sent out, that solicitation, the evaluation method that was used, and how did you end up scoring it, or how did you end up evaluating those proposals that were received. Copies of the actual proposals received, you need to keep all of those. Documentation for why the vendor that was selected, what was the reasoning behind that. And then how the price and contract type was selected, right? Sometimes it is just a straightforward, well, they quoted us $100,000, so we agreed to $100,000. Sometimes there is that kind of negotiation back and forth, in which case then you would want to keep all of that documentation. Okay, and then once you are over that $250,000, there's this additional requirement that you must perform a cost or price analysis in connection with that procurement transaction. So a price analysis is usually the more straightforward one. That's usually the method that's used if you receive more than one proposal back, right? Well, now we can do a kind of a price comparison. Vendor A, quoted us 100,000. Well, let's say we're over the 250. Quote is 300,000. Vendor B quote is 325,000. Right? So we went with vendor A for all the documented reasons that we have, but we know that the price is pretty reasonable because another vendor quoted us 325,000. Right? So you already have kind of that marketplace competition comparison already done for you. Now, if you're not in that situation of being able to do marketplace competition comparison, then you need to do a cost analysis. So this is a little more complex process. It's actually a thorough assessment, kind of breaking down the direct and indirect cost and kind of what led up to that final price that your vendor quoted you. Typically the only way to get that information is to go back to the vendor and really ask for that breakdown. Now I'll say, you know, in some situations, like when you only end up with one vendor, sometimes you could still maybe do a price comparison, right? It might not be based on a different proposal that was received back, but maybe it's from past history of other costs that you were quoted, or maybe you're still able to do a web search and kind of see what that cost might be out there, right? However, if you are in this situation where you really only have one quotation and you're in a non-competitive procurement situation, and the only way to figure out if that price is reasonable is to have them break it down and kind of look at the individual components, then you might be in a situation of needing to do a cost analysis. It doesn't happen very often, but I have had some clients that had to do that. And they did say it was kind of hard to get that information from the vendor, right? Because one of the elements is profit, typically that's in there, right? And what vendor wants to go and say, oh yeah, we tacked on a 15% profit margin there. But you know, it's just something that if you go back to them and say, we actually need this to be in compliance, you know, would really appreciate it if you could provide that information. Oftentimes just saying you need it to make sure that you're in compliance with your federal regulations, with your grant terms and conditions, they're a little more willing to give that price breakdown. Okay, so now going into this kind of fifth methodology of non-competitive procurements. This is when the procurement is really through the solicitation of a proposal from only one source. It actually should just say a procurement from only one source. We're just kind of going only to one vendor. I mean, it's sometimes referred to as a single source or a sole source. You could hear it as that as well. Really, non-competitive procurements themselves are a little more encompassing than that, because it could be, right, when the item is available only from a single source. And so you call it a single source procurement. With that one, I'll say, you know, you want to be cautious of if you're assuming that, oh, there's just one vendor that can provide that good or service for us. Make sure you're doing your due diligence to kind of support that, right? We actually, one time during an audit, had to rate a client up, unfortunately, for that, because they were so sure that, oh yeah, just the vendor, that's the only one that's out there. Well, we were able to find within, you know, 2 minutes another on the, by doing a web search, another vendor that actually did provide that good. So sometimes this will be, I'd say, the most common time when I see this happen. Well, actually, I'll give 2 examples. One of them, it was when I was working with a research organization and they needed dog cadavers to do their research. And I guess there really truly was only one vendor out there that has those available for purchase for research. So, so that was an example where he could support, yes, that vendor is actually the only one that I can procure with. But also if there is such, it's not here. If it is such a specific item that you need to match up with, let's say, a certain network platform that you have. I'm actually working with an organization now that received from some ARPA money for a broadband project, right? And they only buy their fiber cables from this one vendor. That's the only thing that'll match up with their system. And they had already named them kind of right in the proposal as we're planning to use them, because this is the only one that will match with what we need to provide our service. So maybe it is something that needs to be, again, to match up with your systems or compatibility. Another situation when you can have the top of that should say non-competitive proposals, the top of this slide, is if there's a public exigency or an emergency that would not permit a delay resulting from competitive solicitation. I'd say kind of pre-pandemic, I used to always be able to say, this is really only seen in like FEMA grants, right? Where they just need to get things in place to respond to like a natural disaster. We saw it actually quite a bit though, during the pandemic, for those situations when organizations just needed to get something in place, you know, the PPE, whatever the cost was. They just needed to get hand sanitizer, from whatever source they could. I would say typically it would be very, you'd be well aware from your awarding agency, your pass-through entity, if you are in a situation where you can just do emergency non-competitive procurements. You can't really just assume that it is. It's something that would be pretty well known and put within your terms and conditions. Or another situation when non-competitive procurements are okay is if your federal awarding agency or pass-through entity expressly authorizes it in a response to a written request, or that should say if they've already pre-approved it, like in your grant application. I've seen that before, right? So in your budget narrative, you might have already said, we're going to use vendor A. And at that point, usually you need to justify why it is that you are going to use that vendor. Again, maybe it's for compatibility reasons. Maybe it's because they're just really the best in the business for, for doing that. Whatever it might be, if you've already put that in your budget narrative, that was approved by your awarding agency and is part of your grant agreement kind of package, then that's already been authorized. If it wasn't already named, but you really think, oh, we have good justification just using this one vendor, you really want to go that route, then you need to reach out to your awarding agency or pass-through entity and ask for permission to do a non-competitive procurement. Again, make sure all of that is documented so you have that properly justified. And then this is a situation where, yes, go ahead.
There's a question to that. Is there, if an agency publicly solicits, advertises, and still only receives one response by a vendor / contractor, is that considered a single source? And that's coming from Veronica out in Deming today.
Great question, Veronica. And you literally just teed up this fourth box here for me that states this is acceptable if after solicitation of a number of sources, competition is determined inadequate. So your situation and what Rich was bringing up before is really when the regulations say, hey, if you tried and you did your due diligence to try to get an adequate number of proposals and there's just really only one of them that's even interested, right? There's just not the interest out there. Well, then you've kind of defaulted, if you will, to the non-competitive proposal situation, right? In that case, I would say make sure you have documented all of your attempts or, where you publicly advertise it, right? Which should all be in your procurement records anyways, kind of where you put your solicitation, where it was advertised. But then also if you're in this situation, we reached out to, we tried to, contact these 3 vendors, see if, they were interested. Again, kind of keep that documentation to show that we really tried to, or maybe you extended the date, to allow for additional bids to be received. Well, that still didn't, garnish any additional interest. So just kind of make sure you have documented the steps that you took to try to get it. And if you end up here, well, you end up here. And it's just, it really comes down to that justification. And I will say, that might be a situation where, unfortunately, you might end up in a cost analysis situation. I said I did have a client that had to do cost analysis, and it was because they ended up here, where only one responder responded back. They didn't even have anything to compare it to say, is this amount that they quoted us? Is that reasonable? And so just be aware of that too. If it's over 250,000, you've only received one bid back, and if you have no other way of comparing it to see if that's reasonable, then you might have to do that cost analysis. All right, so documentation when you get into non-competitive procurements. So you need to have documentation of the justification that the use of sole source needs. Justification of the use of sole source needs to be documented. If you are in that situation, right, of we're just going to one. Document any research on availability from multiple sources, right? You don't really want to assume that it's a sole source that only one vendor can provide it. Again, you'd want to probably document that, yep, here's our search results. There are no other vendors out there that can provide it. Retain documentation on authorization, if that's a situation you're in, where you reached out to your pastor entity or to your awarding agency and they said, yep, you can go ahead and use, vendor A. Make sure you have that documentation. And then document, again, in the initial solicitation, to kind of talk through this, that you tried to get from multiple sources, or if you got them back and they were kind of just inadequate, right? They were incomplete. And you just reached out to them and said, hey, you're missing, these other pieces. They just didn't respond. Or if you're in that situation where you did just only get one, but you reached out to other ones to try to get that adequate number. Again, just make sure you have that all documented. All right, here's some questions. Thank you, Andrea, for getting that poll up. All right, you must use the vendor with the lowest price. Is that true or false?
The room all said false.
False. All right. I see another 2 more falses coming through. All right, you guys are all correct. Good job. That is something I do try to stress very highly during these trainings, is because I think that is just a misconception is federal funds, you got to go lowest price. That's oftentimes the case, but not necessarily, it's not a must. Okay. All right. How many rate quotations must you get for a vehicle purchase? 1, 2, 3, or 4?
The room said 1, but 3 is best practice.
Let's see, this is kind of and when I put together this question, I had the answer selected as 2. It says must you get. Now, per the regulations, if you look at the methodology, it depends on the dollar amount, right? The vehicle, is less than 10,000. You might only need 1. It's over 10,000, you might need 2. But I think it comes down later when we talk about actually vehicle purchasing process, where it kind of references that you should get at least 2. So you're right, best practice is 3. However, the question does ask, must you get for a vehicle purchase? So you're right, 3 is probably the best answer. 2 is the answer when you're looking at the absolute requirement.
Question, Rebecca, what happens if you can't get 2?
For a vehicle?
Yeah.
Then I would really say you'd want to make sure that that's true. And are you limiting what kind of vehicle you're looking for, right? Are you very specific about, I need
No, we're being very inspecific, and we have gone out several times, and the
some dealerships just don't have like the quality or the quantity of the trucks that we need sometimes.
and they answer back that they can't even give us a quote,
Yeah.
and all we get back is 1.
Then I think it kind of goes back to that situation that we just talked through about document your efforts, right? Who you reached out to, what was their response, and just make sure that you have that all properly justified, right? If you can only get 1, then you can only get 1. But as long as you're doing your part to try to obtain more than 1, then just make sure you have documentation to show the rest.
Part of it is that with the manufacturing of vehicles and COVID, they can't get us a vehicle within a time frame that we have to get documentation to be able to get the vehicle, right?
That's what we did, yeah.
We'll get a
Supplies.
right. So if we say, well, we have to get approval after we get your bids, And it takes all this time, they're like, we're not gonna commit that vehicle because the next guy will come in and buy it in the next 4 hours.
Yeah.
Yep, and I think I remember when we had met a couple weeks ago or a month ago, you know, we were talking about this when Trey and David and Andrea and I talked about how that's a real issue, right? And so we can talk through that further when we talk about the equipment purchasing process, but knowing that we're in a time crunch situation these days where that approval needs to happen like real quick, right? Or you're right, someone could walk in and walk off with that same vehicle on that same day. So I think maybe we can talk through that when we talk about the equipment purchasing process and how to really maybe deal with that and get Troy and David's kind of perspective on what that process would look like. Okay, question. When can you use a brand name in a solicitation? Always, never, or sometimes?
We had a few sometimes.
All right. I see 1 always, and I see 2 sometimes. All right, so there's sometimes is how I would answer this. Right, but if you do, you should put or equivalent, right? If that's really the only way that you can describe, right? It comes back to making sure that the offer has a good idea of what it is you're looking for. If the only way to get that across is to do a brand name, then you need to put or equivalent. Right, it would be acceptable if, again, you're in a situation where you really need those Apple iPads because you're on an Apple platform and they're the only ones that would function. Then you could maybe get away with it, but then you would need to have that good justification for why it is that you can only purchase those Apple iPads. All right, and at what amount do you need at least 2 rate quotations required for procurements? Is it at the 7,500? When you get over 10,000? When you get over 12,500? Or when you get over 25,000?
Should that question be worded over what amount do you need at least 2 rate quotations?
Yes, it should be at what, yeah, once you get to that amount and anything over, do you need at least 2 rate quotations? All right, I see a 25,000 answer here. What is the room saying?
There's a 10 in the room.
Yes, 10,000 is a correct answer. That is the micro purchase threshold. If you recall, anything under 10,000, price just needs to be reasonable. Anything 10,000 to 250,000, you just need at least 2 rate quotations required. All right, federal procurement checklist. So as I mentioned, I put together this tool called the Federal Procurement Checklist that is available for you to use as a resource. I've designed it in a way to be as comprehensive kind of as possible. I find that organizations tend to think it's really helpful, especially for those organizations that aren't procuring with federal funds kind of day in, day out, so that when they do, it's, you know, they're trying to jog their memory of, oh yeah, what are all those things that we need to be thinking about, that we need to document? What are those dollar amounts we need to be aware of? So it's kind of tried to take all of that, put it together in a checklist, right? So you can document, okay, what project or what, you know, grant is this being used for? Do you spot to describe what it is that you're purchasing? What are you procuring? All right, and then there's an area to select which method of procurement you're following. If you're really, if it's the micro purchase threshold, this checklist, I'll say it probably doesn't need to be utilized. It's really once you get over the 10,000 when you need to start documenting these items, right? So if it's small purchase, all right, what are the 2 or 3, rate quotations that we got, right? Maybe along with this checklist, so you want some additional documentation to support it. But either way, this is a good way to summarize. What was the vendor contractor name? What was it that they, the item or the service that they procured back on? Usually it'll match up with what it is that the goods and services that you documented up above that you're procuring. Total cost, and is there any other consideration, right? Maybe this is a good spot to document why you picked vendor 1 over vendor 2. Again, it doesn't have to be super lengthy, it can just be a quick note. This gives you opportunity to document those. If you're over the $250,000, and I'll be honest, this checklist is written in a way that assuming that if you get over that dollar amount, you go the competitive proposal route instead of the sealed bids. I think still it could be used, right? Because you'd still be documenting a lot of the same information. All right, so yep, we're actually in the competitive proposal amount. All right, so list up to the 3 proposals. If you have more than 3, right, maybe you don't need to list them out all here. Again, you're going to want to make sure though that you have record of all the proposals that you did receive back. To make sure that those are all saved properly and accessible. But here, maybe you just want to list up to the top 3, right? These are the top 3 contenders that we picked. Again, what was the cost? Here, it gives a little more detail of why was the reason that you chose this vendor or contractor? Well, maybe it was because they were the lowest bid. Maybe it was because they provided the best evaluated responsible offer, right? They might not have been the lowest, but we thought they were going to be the most advantageous to the program. Maybe they establish or maintain essential research, development, or technical capacity. Compatibility with other components of a system already exists, right? That's one that I see sometimes in clients of, boy, it would actually at the end of the day be more efficient, to maybe even stick with the vendor, even though they went out, got other bids and quotes, but they knew if we were changing our, let's say if a software system is actually a real example, right? Man, if we were going to be switching over a certain software system they were using, it would be an incremental more amount, right, than to stick with the vendor that we are at. And so that was their justification. If there's only the vendor or the contractor met the pre-established performance characteristics, right? They're really the only one that could perform successfully on that contract. Or perhaps there's another reason, right? So it gives you an opportunity. These ones with the asterisks are typically ones that you'd want to, jot down an additional kind of explanation as well. And again, maybe it doesn't all fit in this little box, but maybe you say see memo titled whatever it might be, and you have a supporting note. All right, and then again, remember, once you get over that $250,000, there needs to be a price or a cost analysis done. It could be based on, maybe you did based on the adequate price competition, right? Well, we got our 3 bids. We know that the price is reasonable. Maybe a catalog, market pricing, historical pricing. Again, yeah, in the past, they quoted us pretty similarly, so it seems reasonable. Maybe comparison to similar items. Well, that would require additional explanation, right? What were those similar items? Cost analysis spreadsheet. Again, if you're in that situation of needing to do a cost analysis and break it down, then you should have some kind of underlying spreadsheet or document that does that for you. If the award specifically identified, right, sometimes you actually already have that in your awarding documents, that we're going to use a vendor for this purchase, and we estimate it's going to be X amount. Well, then you've already kind of gotten that approved within your award documents. All right, the regulations kind of point back to, at a starting point to consider whether the price was reasonable. When it's talking about price or cost analysis, it kind of says, what was the projected cost of it, kind of internally? What did you think the ballpark was going to be? Well, we thought it could come back in somewhere between 300 to 350,000, or you know, whatever that might be. But it does actually point back to kind of your initial assumption of where you thought those bids would land. So here's the opportunity to document that. This is an opportunity on the same checklist that if you are in the non-competitive procurement situation, well, why is it allowable? Again, is the item or service only available from that vendor? Is there an unusual or compelling urgency or emergency that would preclude the full and open competition? Did you get approval from the granting agency, or again, other? And that's kind of where if you are kind of defaulted into the non-competitive procurement, right? This is where you can document all of that. These are those additional considerations that I've kind of talked throughout this training, right? Well, that's a consideration. That's something you should think about. Clearly document here. Is a procurement necessary to accomplishment the program objectives, right? Well, hopefully you're answering yes. Was consideration given to in-house capabilities of personnel? That's something that the regulations kind of point to of, you know, prior to just going out and assuming you need to hire a consultant or a contractor, right? Did you consider, is this something we could do in-house that might be more efficient and more economical, right? So hopefully if you're in this situation of procuring, you would have already thought through that. And so then you'd have to answer that yes. You know, sometimes because maybe you do have the capabilities, but you just don't have the resources, right? They're already fully, they already have their own roles and responsibilities. They don't have time to do it, right? So we do have to go and get this out by an outside consultant, right? But it's something you should be considering. Again, consideration given to consolidating or breaking out. It's an analysis made of lease versus purchase. Was consideration given for using federal excess and surplus property in lieu of purchasing new equipment and property? There's an option and there's a website you can go to see what the federal excess property is. So it's saying, you know, if that's, it should be something you give consideration to. I really don't see it very often where organizations can or do utilize the federal excess property.
Hey, Rebecca, I think we just hit the break for lunch point. Do you think this is a good?
Oh yeah, I thought this was almost wrapped up, but yeah, let's take a break here. Sorry, I didn't realize there was a couple more slides up.
Just by 1 minute. I know David, I think he may have ordered in lunches for some folks. So I wanted to try to stick to our schedule. David or Troy, does that still sound right for you, or is this a good stopping point?
Yes, that's correct. That still sounds right. He did order lunch in, it's here. Okay. And this does seem like a natural breaking point.
Okay. All right. That sounds good. I just wanted to remind everybody that I put the attendee afternoon link again in the chat. Rebecca, David, Troy, I sent you your presenter links for the afternoon. I'm going to end this so we stop the recording and we'll record the afternoon session.
Sounds good.
Sounds great.
Good lunch, everyone.
Okay. See you just before 2:30. Maybe we could just get back on, make sure we're all good.
Sounds good.
12:30 our time.
Okay. Yes. Sorry. Yes. Okay. See you soon.
Bye.